This is a Jack Kemp Oral History Project interview with Joanne Kemp, Jack Kemp's wife. Today is December 10th, 2012. We're doing this at the Kemp home in Bethesda, Maryland, and I'm Morton Kondracki. When you, what do you think that people ought to know about Jack Kemp that they may not know?
Probably the things that aren't known about him are his personal side, which is very tender, believe it or not. He is from a family of 4 boys, strong mother, very gentle, kind father, and I think that he has the tendencies of both of them, and you never know how that mix is going to come out. But I think he is very tender. He and his brothers all tear up very easily. They did. His only 2 brothers are still living, and I think that's the personal side of him that probably people didn't see because he was such a competitor and achiever.
What did he tear up about?
Mostly family. And if he would see somebody really in great distress and he could see how their life, of poverty or whatever it was, that would, if he really got to know the person.
So his tell me what you know about his family life, his growing up.
Well, his parents both came from out of state to California when they were young, and those were the Depression days. And his father attended high school only. His mother was a college graduate. She went to University of Montana and Cal Berkeley. And they met as young adults from 2 different families, one from Montana, his mother, and his father from, I think it was South Dakota. And father from a very big family, mother from a smaller family. She had no sisters, only 2 brothers. So she was very strong, competitive. She was on the basketball team, I think, at Cal, girls basketball. I mean, that's a long time ago. And his father was a good athlete in high school baseball and just a kindly man. He was one of 11 children, I think it was. In fact, there are pictures downstairs, the whole lineup of them. And his father had to work very hard delivering packages, and you've probably heard that story, and then having a small trucking business. So his father worked so hard that he didn't see his kids much because he went to work really early to get things loaded on either his motorcycle delivery or then his truck delivery, and didn't get home until sometimes when the kids were in bed. So I think that they were very home-centered. Their mother, although she was strong and competent in other fields, she knew Spanish and she was a social worker. So she was academically, she liked history. She got them interested in all sorts of ideas and was very caring about, the underprivileged. So I think for her day, she was sort of ahead of things. And then she had these 4 boys, and that was just, she knew boys. She didn't really ever have girls, no sisters. And
what was your relationship with her like?
It was wonderful. I think she was very pleased when Jack and I got married. And I don't know, I think he was probably tough to raise. I think he was, I don't know for sure. They never told me. But I know my sister-in-law just made me know that they were very happy that we got married. And she was not, she was good. She knew how to give good gifts to girls. And she started knitting. I mean, here's this strong woman, but she started knitting, and I think she did that going to these games. She went to as many games as she could. She probably got to go to more of the boys' athletic contests than their dad did. But she wasn't totally caught up in it. She'd just knit and be there.
So just to follow up the first question, independent of what people don't know, what do you think Jack's signal contributions, his life and his career are that people should remember him by?
Well, I think first of all, when people started knowing about him was his athletics. So he was tenacious, he was competitive, he was confident, even though he was small and drafted way down. At least he was drafted for pro football, but he went to a small school. He was always competitive. So I think that his tenacity and his competitive nature were the first thing that people would have remembered him by. But then, as he went on into his pro football career, he was that way for the first few years, and then he started studying other things, and he had added something to his football because he was maniacal about football for the first probably 23 years of his life. However, we had a good college education, so he was interested in music and arts and those kinds of things because his mother exposed them to that. You know.
Actually, that's something that people don't really know a lot about Jack Kemp, is his interest in...
Yes.
Played the piano.
Well, he
knew ballet.
He loved classical ballet. He loved we had similar interests in those arts because I had a musical background in my family, and we both had an interest in government and politics and education. We were both education majors, and we had a lot of things in common like that. But the arts side of him was really amazing to me because I didn't realize how interested he was in that until we got to talking in college, and I realized that he had some interest in those things.
And did that continue into his adulthood? I mean, did you have tickets at the Kennedy Center?
Oh, well, we went a lot to that, and in Vail, one of the things we loved doing so much was the concerts in the summertime. They had the New York Philharmonic for 10 days, residency, and same with the Dallas Symphony and the Philadelphia Orchestra, and for the first couple years, the Rochester Symphony. So that's 3 different orchestras that resident there for a whole month plus. So we'd go to concerts like 2 and 3 times a week because they were such great concerts. Classical, almost always classical. We'd go to the Pops also because we liked musical theater. So yes, we'd go to, it was just a given that we would go to whatever musical was.
Just as long as we're in this train, did he get popular music too? I mean,
oh yes.
And did he stick with? I mean, did he know about rock and the Beatles and all that stuff?
He wasn't as into that. The Frank Sinatra, he and my brother-in-law, the one that introduced us, my sister and he are no longer married, but they were both football players, fraternity brothers, and they viewed themselves as sort of a Frank Sinatra equal. They could sing those Frank Sinatra songs, so they would. In fact, my brother-in-law just made a CD of him singing Mike Quint. And so, yes, he kept up with popular music that we liked, and then Elvis came in, and where my son-in-law just is an Elvis real fan, that never hit us. The Ed Sullivan Show we watched, and so we always knew what was in. He always knew that, and he was such a quick study.
Bruce Springsteen.
No, but our kids were. But no, neither one of us, that was not, we liked the things we already liked, and we didn't, by then we were off into politics and raising family, and I feel that I had kind of a gap there. So now, the age that I am, I'm trying to think of the names of the group. Springsteen, yes, but then those other groups that Jeff liked, they've gone by. The Beatles, we did listen to the Beatles. I remember telling my kids, I'm not sure that Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds is just an innocent little song back when they were in elementary school. So I would listen.
Right. Okay. Talk about your courtship. I mean, when did you first lay eyes on Jack Kemp, and Well, probably it was when he was playing football in college. So I just knew of him by watching him play football. Mm-hmm.
And then Mike Quint was in a biology class with me, I think it was, and so one day he said, Jack Kemp would like to go out with you. Can I introduce you? So that's how I first met him.
Mm-hmm. And then what did you do together?
Well, we went to a fraternity party then, and then we probably went to, I don't know, maybe a date, and then I asked him to go to a sorority house party in the mountains skiing. believe it or not, in California, they had good skiing in the mountains when there was snow. So that, and Jim Mora, he said, well, yeah, can you get one of your girlfriends to invite Jim Mora? So they got a free ski weekend. So then we were dating off and on.
So this was, you were which year
I
and
must
he was
have,
what?
I must have been a sophomore. That must have been the winter of my sophomore year. I don't think we started dating until like the
He was
late
a year
fall.
ahead of you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we went on, out off and on. I went out with other people too, and I still have my old calendar somewhere of, you know, who I was having coffee with or going to a party with or whatever.
So what kinds of things did you do together?
Well, we'd go in his little MG out to Malibu and go to a little restaurant on the ocean, have probably hamburgers or something. One of the things he liked about me, he told me, was that I like to eat. So he figured if I like to eat, I must have to cook. So I did. And then every once in a while, on a Sunday evening, by that time, this was my junior year, his senior year, he and Mike Gwint and Jim Moore and some of those guys lived together in an apartment. So I would go over there and probably make hot fudge sundaes. It was his mother's recipe that she had given me. And then I'd end up cleaning up the kitchen. And it didn't bother me that I was...
So what did you discover that you had in common?
Just an interest in discussing ideas. I was taking philosophy class that I loved a lot. We had a history of civilization class that had art and literature and history and philosophy, everything in it, economics. And so, you know, every once in a while we'd talk about those things, but really we weren't any deep intellectual anything. It was just that he was interesting to talk to and to be around. And he was a strong personality. And they all had great senses of humor. And I appreciated that, because I think I know I'm from a Scottish, even-tempered, sort of keep it in type of background. And he was a lot more outgoing.
So did you ever get pinned or officially going steady or anything like that?
No. Then he graduated and went to play pro football and was drafted, I don't know, 17th or something, and went to the, was it Pittsburgh or Detroit? Detroit Lions first. And so then he was gone that year, and I was sorority president and a senior education major and going to be doing my student teaching in the last semester of my senior year. So he was gone all that year, but we would talk. In those days, you know, there was no email. Long-distance telephone you hardly ever did. But about once a week or once every other week he'd call, usually on Sunday nights. Because by that time, you know, I had a lull, and it was probably good for him too, because it was after the game of that weekend. And so, you know, we would write letters too, probably once every other week. I don't know.
These are love letters?
Well, I've got them still. That's sort of, but you know, we were not really. I was dating other people, and whereas I had dated mostly athletes, but the first part of my college career, by that senior year, I was dating SAEs, and they were not athletes; they were the intellectuals, and so the class president, and you know, some other pre-med guys, and you know, they were a whole different group, but my girlfriends mostly were going out with those guys, where I'd been going out with the jock. And that was fun. I mean, I enjoyed that, but I wasn't serious about anybody. But I did have dates all that.
So were you surprised when he proposed to you?
Oh yeah, that, you know, he was Jack. He did it just like he did a lot of other things.
Well, so
I think he decided, we didn't ever talk about it because he did it. He bought a ring, I guess, when he was in in Detroit. Let's see. No, what happened? He was in Detroit, and then when Buddy Parker went to Pittsburgh to coach the Steelers. He took Jack along. Jack and Lenny Dawson went with him. I think that's it. Have you looked into the football stuff?
Yeah, I can't keep it straight. Whether
I think
the
that's what
Giants were in
happened.
there someplace too.
Oh no, that's later.
Okay, all right. You got it better than I do.
Yeah. So he went from Detroit, where he did training camp in rookie year, and I think it was during that season. I can't believe that they would do it in the middle of the season, but maybe they did. Buddy Parker took the job at Pittsburgh and took Jack and Lenny Dawson with him. But anyway, I can't remember that because I wasn't there. I was paying a little bit of attention to details of football, but I was also a senior and doing all my stuff. And I didn't have any thought that we were going to get married in any near future. So, but it was fun to be with him, and so we would go. So then he came home for that. The season was over, and he came home probably December 20th or something. And so we went to movies. I remember we went to see My Fair Lady, and we probably went to his parents' house for dinner and whatever. And I would stay overnight there once in a while because I lived an hour plus away from Los Angeles, and his family lived maybe 20 minutes from campus. So I'd see him then. And then we went to a New Year's Eve party at a friend of ours' home, and he had told his fraternity brothers and my sister and Mike, who had introduced us, to leave the room at midnight because he had bought me an engagement ring and he was going to give it to me and surprise me. So that's what he did and told everybody. So I was a little bit on the spot, and I felt that way because I didn't feel like we had talked things through. And it was my winter break, but we went back soon after New Year's, and he was then going to be, he'd already signed up, he was going to do his basic training for the Army so that he could get it done right then in those 6 months and then go back to play football. I think it was a 6 months basic training for Army. So everything was really condensed.
So did you say yes?
I didn't say no.
What did you say?
I told him I loved him and he loved me. And so yes, but it was not what you think.
This is very unusual.
It's very unusual, but it wasn't unusual in his life.
Why?
Just because he was impetuous in certain ways, and yet he kept things like that probably to himself too much. And I did too. I just figured, well, he'll go in the Army, and then he'll be there for 6 months. And then I will be out of college, and I will need to be teaching school next year, which most of my friends were going to be doing. And so I had not thought about the future like that. But in my day, people did get married after college, and my roommate was going to. My roommate the year before had already gotten married, and so it wasn't unusual.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how surprised were you when he proposed?
10. Yeah, I was absolutely stunned because I had not envisioned having to think about that, for one thing.
And had you envisioned spending your life with him?
Well, sort of, but on a scale of 1 to 10, maybe 3. But I had lots of other guys that I had gone out with who, really did like me. But I didn't have anybody else that I felt like I did about him. I don't know why that was. I think it was just the conglomeration of who he was.
And so then how long did it take you to get married?
Well, then we were engaged, and he went off to Fort Ord to do his basic training, and we were going to get married. He said, I want to get married before I go back to training camp. So that meant July. So I was doing my student teaching, sorority president, getting my last year of college in. I made the best grades I ever made that senior year, and planned a wedding. Had a couple of bridal showers, the whole deal. So it was like my life was totally full, and I didn't even have time to think about it. And we did not have any marriage preparation per se. I had been taking a class from the physics professor, I think it was, who was also taught marriage. I don't know why they had that at Occidental College. And I had already signed up to do that. So that was good. I was glad I had done that. I'm really surprised now. I'm sure they don't have anything like that.
So were
now.
you as religious then as you are now?
I had very strong faith. I think he liked that about me. He knew I had sound morals. And I liked it about him, that he was interested in spiritual things. Because yes, I can remember sitting in the quad several times at school talking about philosophy and, and I found out more and more. I already knew about his background, but I didn't know what you need to know, really, because it's complicated. And it has metaphysics that's very different than lots of Christian religions.
So, what did you learn about Christian Science? I mean, because he was raised as a Christian Scientist,
and
right?
he was raised probably equally active as a family as my family. However, Christian Science is so different that they really, by the time he was out of college, he'd gone to what they call your association meetings. So they really prepare you to answer the questions that you're going to have from conventional Orthodox Christians. So, and he was smart. And I'm average academic, whatever. And he would have probably been a good lawyer if he had that temperament, but because he really was bright.
What were his grades like at Oxy?
They were pretty good. He broke his leg one year, and it was hard for him to get up to the third floor for his German class, and I think that he probably flunked that. So he didn't have great grades, but he had and most of the things that he had to take were kinesiology and all the science of being a physical education major. So he did fine academically, and his grades were never a question.
So, after you got married, what were the early years of your marriage like? Were you a football follower? I mean, did you go to camp and go to all the games?
No. Well, yes, to the extent that anybody could. So after we were married, we flew to Pittsburgh because there was not time to drive our car. He had turned in his little red MG and gotten a station wagon, which was, wow, this is grown-up life. And but we didn't have time to drive it back before training camp started, so we flew back. And he went to training camp, and I got an apartment and sort of set up housekeeping, but he could only come like one day a week. But I got to know the baseball players that lived in that apartment complex, so because it was still baseball season, so the Pittsburgh Pirates, some of them lived there. So, I was immediately into homemaking and starting to cook, and his parents, I think it was, drove our car back there and stayed a day or two, and then they flew home. And I mean, that was expensive. His parents were not well traveled. I had never been east when I came back to Pittsburgh for training camp. I had never been out of California, except to Arizona. So,
tell me about your own background. So, your parents.
My father came to my grandfather came to Santa Barbara, California when my grandfather was 2 years old when his parents came to Santa Barbara from Scotland. I don't know how they got to Scotland. I mean, I don't know how they got to Santa Barbara as opposed to the East Coast.
This is
my father's. My father's father was from Edinburgh area of Scotland.
And what was his name?
Alexander Maine. That's my grandfather. And his father's name is Robert, I think. So they came to where Santa Barbara, University of California at Santa Barbara is now, Goleta. And so all of that area that is now University of California at Santa Barbara was ranches. And my grandfather's father worked on a ranch. They called them ranch, and they were raising walnuts and I don't know whatever else they raised. And so I remember as a little girl going to my Scottish grandmother's home. She was a very dignified Scottish brogue grandma. Well, she was my great-grandma. And then my father's family ended up being in Lompoc, California, which is near Camp Cook, which is now Vandenberg. And then the Depression came. That family were all Democrats. And they thought Roosevelt was great because of the WPA. Is that what it's called? So my grandfather, when the Depression came, they had to get out of the ranching, and he worked building the runway at Vandenberg in cement work. So they were really good at cement. And then my grandfather, by the time I knew him, he was the postmaster in Lompoc, California, which is the town near Vandenberg. It was called Camp Cook then, and then it became Vandenberg. So my grandfather was a wonderful guy, very outdoorsy. They hunted and they, did pit barbecues and all that kind of stuff. And it's a rural area. Have you ever been up there near Santa Ynez and it's north of Santa Barbara, and it's a great part of California. It's still beautiful and unspoiled. So that was my roots were north of where I grew up. I grew up in an hour north of Los Angeles in Ventura County, which is near Santa Barbara. And Jack's family, we met at Occidental, so he had grown up right in Los Angeles.
And your mother?
My mother was from the Los Angeles area near Pasadena, and she was an only child. And both my parents went to Occidental College. So that's how they met. And my father was one of 6 kids, and I think 2 of them went to college, and his brothers were in the service. And so that family was a large family, and we saw them once in a while. But in those days, it was a long drive by car, probably 3 hours to get up to where my father's family lived. And it was about an hour and a half to get to where my mother's family lived. So we lived in a small town where my father ended up being superintendent of schools after starting out as a history teacher and a coach. And he was a star athlete at Occidental.
What did he play?
Well, his sports were track and basketball. He was captain of the basketball team. But I think he coached football at this little high school where he was teaching history.
So did you grow up as a jock too?
Well, my parents had 4 children, and the first 2 of us are girls. And so, yes, and we were older. When I was 8 years old, my next brother was born. And then when I was 16 years old, my other brother was born. So my sister and I were sort of my father's boys, because he had one sister and all these other brothers, so he was more a guy's guy. And my mother was an only child and sort of spoiled. Her family had come from Hagerstown, Maryland. Her father had, and her mother had come from Indiana. So, these people who came to California, my mother was born in California, as was my father, but their roots were not California.
So you went to Occidental because your parents had?
That's why I went there, really. Mm-hmm.
And why did Jack go to Occidental?
Well, I think he wanted to play football, and his brothers had gone to USC. And his friend Bob Bergdahl was a really good football player with him in high school, I think, and he went to UCLA. Jack probably wanted to go to UCLA, I think. Maybe one of his brothers remembers this. But he was too small to play football there, and so Occidental wanted him. And he had the grades to get in. You had to have good grades to get in Occidental. I probably was a legacy. I had good grades, but not all A's or anything.
So did you think from the get-go that he would actually make it as a professional football player?
Well, no, because at the beginning in college, he was just one of the guys who was a PE major, like Jim Mora. And Jim Mora was really obviously smart because he was on they called it the honor court for the school. You know who Jim Mora is? Mm-hmm. And so Jim Mora was probably the one you looked up to as being both brainy and an athlete and moral and everything else. He was a good guy. And Jack was one of the PE majors that with him, and Ron Botchin, who ended up being a NFL official for years, years and years, you would have watched him as one of the main officials. And they were all on the football team, along with Mike Quint, who was my class. So there was a whole, since it's such a small school, I mean, Occidental probably only had 1,500 students. We knew almost everybody. So I would not have thought that he would play pro football. My father loved pro football, and we went to both USC games, because my father went to SC grad school. We went to SC games, and we'd go to the Rams games or whatever, which was an hour drive to go from our house, but that was something that we were interested in. So I knew a little bit about pro football.
And here's this guy you're dating who is determined to be a pro football player.
And a guy
and
in my...
thought...
I didn't know he was determined to be a pro football player, just like Jeff Kemp never said that he wanted to even play, pro football at all. They kept it to themselves.
So what did Jack tell you that he wanted to do with his life?
Well, we probably didn't talk that. I thought he was going to be a PE major and teach PE like all of his other friends, and maybe coach. And yeah, his football, you didn't know that was open-ended. I mean, to be from Occidental and get drafted in the NFL was really...
So he didn't talk about his ambition?
No, but we were dating, so I knew that he was, but I didn't talk to him all the time. When they finally did draft him, then he said so, and I thought, oh, that's nice, but, we weren't steady or anything. So it was just sort of out there. I didn't think about it that much. I just assumed he was going to be a coach, and maybe go. And then he did go to graduate school during the off seasons to get his graduate degree in education, which would just put him in better shape after he kept trying to to make it for pro football.
So his early football career is kind of dodgy. I mean, he gets cut, he gets traded.
But that didn't surprise me, and it didn't surprise him either. I mean, I think that he was not self-reflective. He didn't talk about, well, I wonder if I'm going to make this. He just, in his mind, I guess, was determined what he was going to do. The longer you looked at him, he did everything he could to lift weights and to eat right and to practice and to get John Verbotnik, who was the weight guy. In those days, they didn't do all the stuff they do today. So he and his buddies, I remember once we went skiing. No, they went skiing. Those football players went up to Mammoth, which was the big ski area, but it took about 4 hours, 5 hours to get there. And they had weights in the trunk, and he had made them take all these cans of this beef-heavy soup. And so the car broke down because they had all of Jack's weights in the back. So those are the things.
This is in college?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was in college, winter of the college or something. And I just peripherally remember hearing about that.
So what's it like being a football wife?
Well, I liked it very much because I got to know other peers very quickly, like the baseball wives and then the football wives that did come there. And then he got traded. The end of the year we were married and living in Pittsburgh, he played some. So that was nice. That was only his second year. And he was a punter as well as a quarterback. So he was punting in an exhibition game that I flew out for because it was in the Coliseum. And I can't remember why I did. Maybe that was, I can't remember. But anyway, I was there. Well, the coach had told him, just do your long punts because he was a good punter, but don't kick it to John Arnett. And he did, and John Arnett set a record and ran from the end zone back for a touchdown. I remember things like that. And in the military, he would tell me about when he was doing his 6 months basic while we were engaged. He was on the football team at Fort Ord, and he got to meet some pro football players there. I remember the names of some of them. But he knew them. I really didn't.
So did you go to away games as well as home games?
Mm-mm. Because he didn't have money to do that. So I would watch the home games on the away games on TV, and I would go to the home games. Like if we were in Pittsburgh, I probably did go to an exhibition game or two. Then he was no longer in Pittsburgh. Then he got cut right after that run back by John Arnett, because the football coach said, "Jack, you're going to make a great football player somewhere, but not here." That was his way of cutting him. So then we were married, and we said, well, okay, we've got to go back and get our stuff. And we did. I think we flew back to Pittsburgh, got our car, and drove it across country. And then we came to his parents' house because we didn't have a place to live. And so there he was contacting different teams to see if there's anywhere he could go. And the New York Giants picked him up because they needed a backup to Connerly and Heinrich. You're too young to remember.
So then you went back to New York?
So then we flew to New York, and that was our honeymoon year. So this was only September of the year we had been married, the previous July. So a lot happened. So here we were, we'd been in Pittsburgh, went back to California, then flew to New York because we didn't need a car there, and lived at the Concourse Plaza Hotel and practiced at Yankee Stadium and met all the New York Giants. And that's how we ended up buying our first house, because that was the year of the sudden death playoff game with Baltimore, and that's the one that Frank Gifford lobbied for Jack and other backbenchers, or whatever you want to call them.
Taxi squad.
Taxi squad. To get a full share. He said, these guys make less than we do, and they come to practice every day, and they should have a full share. And of course, Sam Huff didn't like that, so he was on the other side. But Jack always said, wow, Frank, you're the one that allowed us to have that $1,250 extra. That's what they got for losing that game. And we put a down payment on a house in California, in Orange County, as soon as we came back after the season. Now that's his second year, our first year of marriage. And we loved being in New York, because we just take the subway and we'd go to shows every once in a while, and, go down to Rockefeller Center and go to Toots Shores. Do you remember that?
So he was with the Giants how long?
Just that year. Because that year the Giants decided that they didn't need him the next year, so they farmed him out to the Canadian League, and it was Calgary Stampeders that he was to go to the next football season, training camp. So he did, but by that time I was pregnant and I was due in July, and that's when he had to go. So, but by that time we had bought our first house, which is brand new. It cost $15,500 in Orange County.
You saved up that money already?
The down payment was $1,250.
I see.
No, because you see, he only made $5,000 a year.
What did he ever make at the end of his career?
I don't know, but he probably made, I don't know if it was 50. I can't remember what it was. But it was nothing compared to what they make now. Even when he was, all AFL or whatever it was he was.
So he gets cut by the Calgary Stampeders, and
because he was going to play.
There was some rule, wasn't there?
No, he did get cut by Calgary because they had Joe Kapp, and so he was going to be their starter, and they didn't need. You can only have so many Americans. Joe Kapp had gone to Cal, I think. So then Jeff was a baby, and Jack got cut. He had not seen Jeff yet because Jeff was born while Jack was still in Calgary. But then he got cut, and so he got to see Jeff sooner than he would have otherwise, because I wasn't going to go up there with the baby. I either stayed with my parents or with, I can't remember that. But he then got picked up by the San Francisco 49ers. So then we drove with baby Jeff up from LA to San Francisco, and then had an apartment there and stayed the rest of that season with San Francisco. And he got activated at the end of the season because their quarterback, oh goodness, Anyway, he's a famous one. Anyway, he got hurt. So they activated Jack. And then Bert Bell, who was the commissioner, said Jack couldn't play because he had played in Canada that year. So that meant at the very end, by this time it was playoff games, I think. So at that point, the AFL was starting. And so Frank Leahy from Notre Dame was working for the league, I think, for the new AFL. So he talked to Jack about signing with the Chargers, who were going to be located in Los Angeles, and that made sense. We had a house there. It was great. I mean, things fell into place like you just couldn't believe. So
Kemp magic.
Yeah, I think it was. But I just took it for granted. And
so you're in the stands watching most of the time when he's playing at home.
Whenever he's at home,
okay,
I would watch, and otherwise I'd watch on television.
Okay, so he got injured so many times: 11 concussions, torn ligaments, broken bones.
No, in pro football he didn't have any broken bones. He had one in college, but
Okay.
I didn't even know him then. So he had knee surgery at the end of the 60, maybe 68 or 67. But that was, ACL, anterior crucial ligament. See, he knew kinesiology and all that, so he would tell me what it was. And that was the worst injury. That's when Ron McDowell fell on him in practice. And after that, he still played. I mean, he recovered from that. And
then there was the finger.
yeah, and that was a minor injury, really, except that Sid Gilman didn't think he'd play again, I think. Or at least he knew he wouldn't for a while. It dislocated.
So you're up in the stands and he gets knocked out. I mean,
you know what? I was not a typical woman, I guess, because I just figured this was his choice of careers, and you could get in a car accident or you could, whatever. And I just took it as part of the deal. And I did not get anxious. I think that was just sort of my training. I mean, I just had a view from the time I was young that God has a plan for everybody's life, and here, this must be what this is for this month. Or
so, who were your best friends among the football wives?
Well, it depends on what year. With the Los Angeles and San Diego Chargers, our relationship with Charlie Flowers started, and he was a great guy. He went to Ole Miss, and he ended up going to law school after that. He was a really bright guy, and he was a Southerner, so he and Jack got into lots of really heated arguments, but they both had such great senses of humor. And Paul McGuire was on that team in 1960 and 61 and 62. So Lance Allworth, I mean, we were couple friends of the Kosuriks for all those years, and the McGuires and the Flowers, Don Norton of Iowa. So there were couples like that were young like we were having their babies, and then the wives would have birthday parties for our kids because we didn't have any families. Nobody had a family in the town except when we were in Los Angeles, Jack and I did, so our families would come to some of the games. But basically, we lived in Orange County, so our friends were the football wives and couples. That was the San Diego years. Then he got traded from San Diego to Buffalo.
And how did you take that?
Well, I loved it, because here we had been living on Point Loma with a view. We'd bought a house. We sold our house in Orange County for a gain, which we did every time. That's how we made most of our money. It wasn't that much, but we made a gain, bought a house looking out at the Pacific Ocean on Point Loma. It was gorgeous. Bought a little water skiing boat. And then he got traded to Buffalo because of that broken finger that he had dislocated like 12 times. He had to go back in and play with it hurt because John Hadel got hurt. After they put John Hadel in, he got hurt, and he was hurt worse than Jack was. So they put Jack back in with his dislocated finger, and by the end of the game, it was really bad, so they said, okay, this is going to have to be set. What shape do you want it? He wanted the shape of a football. So he had the strength in it if it was on a football, but he didn't if it was doing anything else. So that was his, way of operating. So then he was fine. I mean, the rest of his career, he had that dislocated finger. So then we were in Buffalo, and it was a great place because it was
You were perfectly happy to go from San Diego?
Well, we kept the house in San Diego looking out over the ocean. It was just a great house. And had Jennifer then. She was born during the first season of when I was in Buffalo. We lived in a hotel that season, and I was pregnant with Jennifer and had Jeff as this little guy. And, well, Jeff was 3. He was 3 or so. So, I remember flying back home to California. The season wasn't yet over, and we were going to go back to our house in in San Diego. And Jennifer was a baby, so I had to go through the Chicago airport and change planes, and I was like 8 months pregnant. I was going to go back to California to have the baby because I didn't want to be in Buffalo and not. So I went to my parents' home, and that was great. I loved it. So I stayed there for a month, and she was late, and so she was not born until just a little, maybe 10 days before Jack was to get home. And so he didn't see either of them he didn't see Jeff till he was like 6 weeks old, and he saw Jennifer when she was like 10 days old. And it was fine because we'd been in Buffalo. Now we came back home to San Diego, and so we set up we'd already set up our home, and we had our Charger friends. They were still Chargers. We weren't, but we were friends. So that's the kind of relationship you have. It's your family. So I loved that football life.
So his career is now in Buffalo,
Mm-hmm.
and you had a home in San Diego. Did you move to Buffalo when he was
first year?
Bill?
Then when we went back that next year, when Jennifer was a baby, we drove across country with our car, and he was in training camp, and we rented a house. That was it was a furnished house, and we rented, and that was great. And we had all of we then were sort of the seniors in a way, because a lot of them just had young children. Although there were others old, like Billy Shaw had been with the team already, and Ernie Warlick, I think, was with them. And so there were some, but we probably had the oldest child. And so we wives got together every week when the men had something at night. We would play bridge. So we really got to know them. And it was nice to have that rental house. Then when that season was over, we drove back home, stopped in Mississippi on the way to see the Flowers, because they lived in Jackson, Mississippi. And then had the off season in San Diego, and that might have been the year he worked for Herb Klein. I can't remember. And so then when it came to be the next football season, closed up the house and went back and rented another house. And then that year, they ended up beating it was exciting because they beat the Chargers 2 years in a row, which was his old team, and so they won the AFL championship. They may have lost it in the division playoffs to Dallas. I can't remember. So anyway, where am I?
Did you finally buy a house in Buffalo and sort of semi-move?
Not yet. I was getting up to the fact we still had our California house, but we said, and Jeff was going to be going to kindergarten. So we said, you know what, it's about time to sell the California house and buy in Buffalo, which we did. So then that was the beginning of our being in Buffalo all the time.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you about some people, football people. And tell me what you thought of them or what Jack's relationship with Sid Gilman.
Yeah, he was probably the coach that gave Jack his start, because he went with him with the Los Angeles Chargers, and Al Davis was the receivers coach. So they had a really good coaching staff. They had Al Davis as the receivers coach, and he, believe it or not, was a real football guy. And so they would talk offense and, all that kind of stuff. And Chuck Noll was the defensive coach. He ended up being the head coach of the Steelers, I think. And there was at least one other really good coach. So they had a great staff, and that was 1960 Chargers, 61, and 62. And it was 62 that Jack got traded.
So there was some thought that that when Jack
broke his
finger and all that, and it was put on waivers, that somebody tipped off somebody else, and that did Jack ever feel that he?
Yes, everybody in San Diego, he was their big superstar, and
right.
all of a sudden they said, well, he must not be going to play anymore. It must be that was so serious, or else it was a mistake. And, sort of Sid probably said it was a mistake that he put him on injured waivers and not thinking anybody would pick him up because he really was injured. But they did pick him up. I think Denver and Buffalo both wanted him. And so I think that was hard on him. It wasn't so hard on me because I kept saying, well, goodness, look at what's happened so far, But maybe Buffalo will be fine. He can't play here right now. He can't help it that they picked him up. I mean, it was totally out of our hands. And I wasn't upset with Sid, although in the back of my mind I thought, I'm sorry that they didn't do whatever they had to do to keep him, because we loved being in San Diego. But so what? You don't play for the convenience of your personal life. So his parents lived in Los Angeles too, so he was talking to them, and I think his mother said, a door doesn't close, but what another one opens. And my attitude was that too. So the two of us, well, okay, let's figure out where we should go.
That was his attitude too? Yeah.
Now, in the back of his mind, he might have been really, really disappointed, thinking, do they not have confidence in me, that kind of thing. But he still had confidence in himself. So then he went back to Buffalo even before I did, because Jeff was a baby, or little. So I stayed home for a little while until I finally did go during the season.
So when I haven't heard a lot about the LaMonica controversy, but how did he take that? I mean, they were being played off against one another, and
yeah, that was the biggest challenge that he'd had, because before he'd been the taxi squad guy, and now he had established himself in the AFL and done well in the playoff games, and winning the league, the division championship or whatever. So then we go to Buffalo, and they drafted LaMonica, who was a superstar at Notre Dame. So Jack was the older guy by several years. I mean, to us it seemed like a lot of years, but it really wasn't. I don't know, Daryl might be 4 years younger than Jack, maybe 5, I don't know. But Jack had seen a lot of experience, and Daryl was used to being a superstar in big-time football. And so, and Buffalo, being a very Catholic town, loved LaMonica because they'd seen him, play college ball. And so whenever Jack threw an interception or had a bad game or something, there would be calls for LaMonica.
How did Jack take that?
He didn't talk about it. He internalized it. He just made up his mind that he was going to do what he had to do. But I can remember every week knowing that there's pressure. I just thought, yeah, I don't know how he does it. So I just have to fix nice dinners and take care of the kids and, do life, because I'm not in that. And I didn't want to get, some of the wives knew every aspect of football, like Paula McDowell, oh my goodness. She knew football inside out. She knew the quarterback position and all the defenses and that stuff better than I. But I couldn't concentrate on everything, so I let that go. So I figured football's not I'm just here to encourage him to do the best he can.
So what about, tell me about O.J. Simpson.
Well,
what was O.J. Simpson like back then?
Well, he came at
the very
end. The last year of Jack, maybe the last 2 years, maybe because I knew his wife Marguerite, and I didn't know him real well. We knew Cookie Gilchrist, who was there. I think he was there when Jack got there. I think he'd been with the Bills already, and so there was already a dynamic on the team. And you know, then Jack got plugged in after a lot of these guys had been there. Ray Carlton, you know, Billy Shaw, there was the lineman. A lot of the defense had been there, and Ernie Warlick had been there. And so O.J. came and was younger by a good bit, and he was a superstar right at the beginning. But I think that he came the year after Jack got hurt. So I think that by that time Jack was back, and Darryl might have been traded already by then to Oakland. I think so. I think maybe Kay Stevenson was a backup for Jack. I remember even Eddie Rakowski had to come in as a backup once Jack got hurt. Not badly, but I can't remember. But O.J. was well-liked and was a good guy and married to Marguerite then. Then we got... Oh, then he ended his career, Jack did, and came and ran for Congress. And so O.J. obviously was still there. And Jack kept up with him because they had talked politics. O.J. came to his fundraisers, political and everything, and went to Super Bowls. And so we got to know Nicole and her father. So that was just part of our sort of life. They would come to our Super Bowl party a couple times.
So you were utterly shocked when...
Well, yes, except that, you know, when you read about maybe drugs are involved there somehow, and, you know, domestically things go on that you don't have any idea about.
No inkling about it.
And we liked Marguerite, and I don't know. Oh, I know, they lost their child. A child drowned. And, you know, you think, you don't know what goes on when that happens to you. So whatever happened, and by that time we were here and not in the daily life up there.
Right. Right. Okay. So before we leave football, what kind of life lessons do you think Jack took from football?
Okay, you asked me that. Well, I think that we both liked people and different groups of people. You know, we met Southerners that we'd never met before, but a lot of those players were from the South. And then we also had the race relation thing. And we're really good friends with Charlie McNeil and Cookie and Ernie Warlick and Tom Day. I mean, there's just a whole lot of blacks that Jack first, because he played with them. I wouldn't have known them. I didn't have any blacks in the town that I grew up in. There was one black at Occidental when we were there. So that was a whole different world for me. It wasn't quite as different for Jack because he played with them from 1957. He got to know John Henry Johnson? I mean, he would give me these names, and these were black guys. So then when I first went to Buffalo and we had we went over to Cookie's house for dinner, and his mother was there. And I mean, it was culture shock for me. And his mother, Ray Charles, came on music or something, and she said, "Ray Charles, he can put his boots under my bed any day." Things like that I'd never heard, just normal life. And his mother was an alcoholic, so Cookie was always trying to keep her from going to her cupboard to get her. So, I mean, I just remember things that I'd never seen in my life. But it was just life. And so it was a real education for me. And the fact that Jack liked, you know, he never said bad things about somebody else. He was not a gossip. Let's see. And also, one lesson that I learned was that I didn't mind his being gone every other weekend during football season, because that was the time I could concentrate on the children. So in a way, it was a good life lesson for me that, you know, life is what it is right now. And so politics didn't bother me at all, because I was used to liking space when I didn't have to fix a big dinner, because he liked meat and potatoes, and, you know, he liked a solid meal. And I think it also helped me and him with the media, because he was used to booze in sports, and that's how he got paid for taking that. So politics was actually kinder than I remember Susan Baker used to say, "How do you handle this press stuff?" And I said, it's part of the deal.
Well, Susan Baker must have known how to handle the press. I mean, her husband was always in the press.
I know, but this was earlier.
Oh, before
he got, we became friends probably before that.
Jim Baker was not as...
He wasn't as big when I first met Susan.
I see. Okay.
It may have been after he got bigger that we were talking about this. I'm not saying she asked me this before. Mm-hmm. But he had been involved before I knew her. He'd been involved in Texas politics, and he was close to George Bush, but he wasn't a national figure.
Right.
Nobody said anything about him then. Okay, let's see. Helpful. Let's see. Teamwork. That's what I think. He saw that he was the leader of that team. It wasn't just him.
So he had some theories about quarterbacking and leadership. What do you ever remember him telling you about them? Or the kids, for that matter?
He didn't talk about it, but I think that in his mind, every group needed to have a leader. And so as quarterback, he couldn't say, well, I wonder if this would work. He had to know it would work. And he did that in the family, too. His word was, yeah, that's what we did. But he, fortunately, talked with me about family things. So he decided what the kids could and could not do, and he just told me, do it.
What do you mean by that?
The discipline, or if they stayed out too late or whatever it was, he would say, no, this isn't acceptable now, but I'm not going to be here this weekend, so he gave me the authority.
So who was the rulemaker in the household?
Well, I'd say we both talked about it. We agreed on raising our children a lot more, maybe even than our children do on raising theirs. I think we were both pretty firm on there was right and wrong, and I was probably a little bit more flexible than he, because I, in my head, said, you raise your children to let them go. So you only have them for 18 years until they go to college, and then you got to be ready to let them go. So, and I don't think he had thought that through, but I also think that his mother hadn't let him go in certain areas. So I don't know if he'd figured this all out. We didn't. I just did say, we really have got to let them make some of their own minds up. And he didn't like it when the kids would go to church and have grubby clothes on, or if the boys didn't have socks on. And I said, you know what, that's not a major thing. It's great that they're going to church with us. So I had thought about those things. He hadn't, because he was solving the problems of the world. So he listened, and that was no big deal for him. So input there he would take from me, but I knew that he was in charge generally.
Your kids sort of think that you were the one who.
But that's because I was in the little details. Mm-hmm. He was in the big picture, and he just knew that he didn't care about these details, really, except if he'd say so if I wasn't there to say, that's not really a major battle we need to fight.
We'll get back to that. So tell me about his decision to run for Congress and what you thought about it.
That was fine with me. He had been active then, going to Republican Party events in Buffalo. And when we moved from California to Buffalo, it was a whole different culture. The political Republicans were very institutionalized as opposed to what they were like in California.
What do you mean by that?
California was sort of more free, and it was the younger people, at least that we got involved with out there, who were basically conservative, but they were young. So the conservatives in the East were more, this is the way it's always been done. They weren't quite as ideological. They were patronage, because they'd had it. In California, they had, I don't know, maybe we were just in San Diego where it was dynamic. People like Pete Wilson were just getting into politics. And so when we moved to Buffalo, there were a few our town had a young mayor Dave Saunders, who's the same age that we were, and his kids were the same age as ours. And so Jack met some of the political people because they would get him to come and speak for Lincoln Day dinners or whatever. So over those years we lived in Buffalo, bit by bit we got to know the few Republicans that there were, because it was a Democrat, for the most part, town, except there were conservatives. And John Pillion had been a congressman, and he was an old line conservative, but the younger people went with him because at least he was a Republican. And then
so Jack did a lot of Republican stuff,
yes,
while he was playing football.
Yes, and he got criticized for campaigning for Goldwater during that campaign. The sports writers, Phil Ranallo, I remember, he said Kemp is just like Goldwater. He goes back, 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 when he's dropping back to pass, those kinds of things. And I do remember those, but I just thought, well, that's funny. I don't blame Ranallo for saying that, because from where he's coming from, and that was one thing that I told Susan Baker, I said, you got to look at all of these people who were writing about this. They have a worldview, that they went to college, they care about these issues more than the general public, but they also have a starting point. So you have to understand that. And
so Jack is a big integrationist who roomed in training camp with blacks and stuff like that. You went to dinner with blacks, and Barry Goldwater voted against the '64 Civil Rights Act. How did Jack feel about that?
Okay, well then I think he had a grid to start with, because in California, when he had just started football and was out of college, he would read a lot, and he basically read Goldwater's things. How do you stand, sir?
Conscience of a Conservative?
Yeah, those kinds of things. And he was also pretty firmly anti-communist. There was an anti-communist group, I think the guy's last name was Schwartz. And Jack didn't talk much about that, because I think that group ended up maybe being some of the John Birch Society people, which he was not, because that was just extreme on that side. So I think that he always wanted to hear everything, and he probably agreed with a lot of the anti-communism and I don't know what else. And in those days, social issues weren't a big deal, except for integration. It was, but in California, it wasn't a big deal like it was in the East. So that's why when we came here, we saw things that California was pretty, like in LA, they were pretty tolerant, integrated. They didn't have these riots then. The Watts riots came much later.
But did he ever say anything about Barry Goldwater's not voting for the '64 Civil Rights Act? Very soon he realized nobody's perfect, and Goldwater was of another generation. He didn't see that all clearly. So then Jack started writing a newspaper column, sort of like Barry Goldwater's was, only he was the next generation. There was that San Diego Union, or yeah, that was off season.
Union and Tribune, those were both owned by the same people.
So, if Jack never got tempted by the John Birch Society or the real right wingers?
No, but he did take human events, and he read all sorts of things. And he went one off season to Foundation for Economic Education, which is in, I don't know, some Irvington on Hudson in New York. Have you ever heard of them? And so he read their stuff. He was doing that, and he wasn't talking to me about it. He just was gathering all of his stuff and keeping it in his little den wherever it was that we were living. So he was always putting things into his mind, and I really respected that, and I liked it, because it meant that whenever we went anywhere, he would get into really interesting conversations, and that's so much better than the fluff that some people do.
So did you get into that stuff too?
Sort of, but peripherally. I didn't argue with him much, although I wanted to keep up enough so that if there was something I disagreed with him, I could, and I did every once in a while.
Was there ever any thought that he would run for office in California instead of Buffalo?
I don't think so, and I don't know why. It seems strange, because we had a lot more connections in California, but his career was made in Buffalo. So fact, when the Republicans asked him to run for that seat, he had a no-cut contract with the Bills to play at least one more year. And so he didn't have to do that. He wasn't really ready to retire, but I think we both realized, wow, you didn't have to run for town council or board of supervisors or anything. You could run for Congress and, maybe you'd win. But otherwise, he'd have to retire. And I think he was ready to retire then. He was probably 35.
Did he work just one summer for Ronald Reagan or more than
that? Was one off season from the Bills, and we moved our family out there. And yeah, just 1 year.
So did you meet Reagan?
Oh yeah, we lived in Sacramento, and kids two of them went to school in Sacramento, I think, and then Judith was a baby. And yeah, we met the Reagans. We went to they didn't live in the mansion in Sacramento. They lived in a private house. So we went there for a couple of family parties for staff and met most of the Reagan staffers.
So what was the first campaign like?
In 70.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was pregnant with Jimmy. I don't think I knew that I was pregnant at that time. And we started probably in the off season. I think it was like February of the year of the election that he had to say yes, he was going to retire. So that means the Bills had to, they knew he might retire soon anyway. So then we campaigned for, I don't think there was a primary. I'm pretty sure there wasn't a primary. So that was another plus. I mean, yeah, they said, wow, if we can get Jack to run, do. So he did. And that was a really tough race because McCarthy was the guy's last name, and he was a widower with 5 kids. And, one of his ads said, I'm the dad.
McCarthy was the...
No, it's not McCarthy.
Yeah,
that's Max McCarthy. Yeah. Max McCarthy was the seat. He had that seat.
Right.
He was a Democrat. He ran for Senate.
Another Irish name.
But the one Jack ran against was Fletcher or something like that. I can't remember his name, but I can picture him. He was a tall, good-looking guy, and he had five or six kids. And he said, "I'm the dad and the mommy too." And that was a really good ad. And he had been the writer of the charter of the county or something. So he was a lawyer. He was well respected. He was Catholic, and by sense he should win that. Except that that seat had been represented by Pillion, that old guy that I told you was a Republican, before McCarthy.
But it was a swing district.
Yes, and it kept they'd change it sometimes so that it was a blue collar district, except for a couple of really small conservative suburbs.
And what did you do during that campaign?
Oh, I campaigned door to door. We went to coffees. I pushed Jennifer in a stroller. Oh no, Judith in a stroller. Had Jeff and Jennifer. And I'd just go door to door. I'd go to these coffee groups and just speak, not give major policy speeches, but just talk to people, one-to-one. Or just talk to a group about how important it was to be involved in politics. I had started with some people in our town a Republican women's study group soon after we went there. So I knew people through both playing bridge with them and the football players. I introduced a lot of our town people to the football players' wives because the football players didn't have enough people in our group to have 2 tables of bridge, probably. So we all got to know each other, and the people who were interested in politics started a Republican women's study group, and we did our own programs. I can't even believe I did it, but I had been in one in San Diego that was sort of like the League of Women Voters, but it was conservative in San Diego, and the people in our town didn't have anything like that. We did have a League of Women Voters in Hamburg, New York, but they were more liberal. So we really got some ideological women, and most of their husbands were too. They were in business. So it was like our hometown. And
What did you do? What did your women's Republican study group do?
well, we had different topics, and the time that I had to do the program, it was on why are the churches making so many moral statements about, like, open housing and Angela Davis. You remember Angela Davis? All those kinds of things. And they said, what's going on? You know, why are most of the things the churches are saying so against Republican dogma? And so we had discussion groups on that. And a friend and I were on, I think it was education. What's the educational system? What are they teaching in the way of history, that type of thing? So, I mean, I was way over my head because one of the gals was a Phi Beta Kappa, and she'd gone to school in New York at a good school. And so I just sort of enlisted all these other people, and they did a lot of the work. So anyway, I got involved in that.
So when did you move to Washington?
Right after he was elected in 70, in November, and then sworn in, and I started looking for houses down here. In those days, people did move here. Bill Miller, I think his wife lived here, although I didn't ever get to know her very well. She was really nice, Stephanie Miller. And I didn't know congressional people, but figured, I mean, it was a no-brainer. I didn't want to stay in Buffalo and have him be down here all the time. So we came, found a house. I was pregnant with Jimmy. Jimmy was born in June. We moved here in February. And Jack always said he couldn't believe what I did. The kids went to school in Buffalo one day because Jeff and Jennifer were in school. Judith was probably in kindergarten. And so they went to school in Buffalo, and then we flew down here, and they went to school here the next day. But that was just you didn't miss school. I mean, they had to get started. So we moved into a new house, so we had to sort of, get it furnished and everything. But that worked, but we kept our house in Buffalo for a while. So we had to get new furniture here. It was a lot of work. I don't know how I ever did it.
And how often did you go back to Buffalo?
I didn't go back very often because I had 4 kids by June. Jimmy was born in June. So I didn't go back very often. He did. He went, I don't know, maybe 2 times a month. But it was easy. Less than an hour flight and he'd be in Buffalo.
Was it Buffalo's economic distress that got him involved in tax policy?
I saw that question. I'm not...
Did he talk about how bad off Buffalo was?
We saw Bethlehem Steel, losing business and everything. But that, I think that was just starting when he went in 70. And he had labor unions, and he was, he wanted to get as much support from labor unions as he could, and Republicans didn't very often. But he made friends with a lot of these guys, the Building Trades Union and this Docker, lots of those kinds of unions. And he was in the Radio Broadcasters Union, Jack was, and then he was chairman of the NFL Players Association. So he was sort of a union leader. But his father had to deal with the Teamsters and was anti-union. So he had both sides. So I think he had to think things through. And I don't know. I peripherally heard all this. But we didn't sit down and talk about it.
So as Jack is building his career in Washington, you've got 4 kids, but how did you connect up with congressional activities?
Well, first of all, I just got planted here, but I wanted to start them in piano. So I had met Joyce Brown, and she was a congressional wife from Ohio, and she taught piano and lived close to us. So she started, and he was in Chowder and Marching, and Jack was in Chowder and Marching. So I met the wives of Chowder and Marching because they got together more often than they do now. And Jerry Ford was in it. And so I got to know those, Mel Laird, I got to know those people real soon. And I was sort of different because I was pregnant and had really young children. Archer came the same year Jack did, and he had 5 kids, but theirs were a little bit older than ours. And my congressional class DuPont was in it. You get to know your congressional class, both parties, the 92nd Club. So you immediately, if you live here, they don't get to do that anymore. But if you live here and if you're personal, I prefer to be around people. So I just immediately got to know the people in the 92nd group. And then I went to the Congressional Wives Prayer Group, which is both parties, sponsored by the fellowship. I mean, it's the National Prayer Breakfast Group now. But at that point, it was different. They met in the old fellowship house that was down there near the Shoreham, in that area of town. And they met once a month, so I got to know people in both parties who would come to who knew that prayer was not political. And so I got to know people there. You know, I got to know Hatfield's wife and Dellenbeck's wife, and well, that's where I first got to know Grace Nelson, but that was later. But I've always had a mix of friends, and you get to know who, and Colleen Nunn was a really good friend, because they lived close to us and had children the same age. So, well, you know that. That's what you do. You get to know people, and if you have similar careers that your husband has. And in those days, not as many women worked. So it's a whole different world now.
Did you ever think about working?
Well, I did. I had my teaching credential, and in California, I had a job in Glendale, and we were going to come back to California during the off-season after we got married. So I would have probably done substitute teaching, but I did have a job offer before I knew for sure that he was getting traded. So then I went to Pittsburgh, and I think it was Pittsburgh. I got a job there thinking we were going to stay there. But I didn't start because he got cut, and I went back to California. And then I was having, I had one child and another on the way. So no, that's the closest I ever got to actually having a paid job.
What did you like most and like least about being a congressional wife?
I would say that I like everything I liked. The least I figured I couldn't help, and that was just that you didn't have a normal life. On weekends, as a family, we didn't do things with other families because we weren't to be counted on. And when he was home, he didn't want to get to know some new neighbors. And we did get to know the parents of Jeff's football team. And then Jimmy came along, 12 years later, but we got to know some of his, that's the way. But here in Churchill High School District, it's not a little community. So we didn't really get to be good friends with other families. And at church, we had a few of their friends whose families we got to know, but mainly because if I was going away, I needed a place for Jeff to stay so he could go to his practices. And so it was sort of a convenience thing. So I would say the downside was that we weren't a normal family. And the people that weren't in politics, that were normal citizens, had their own lives, and we weren't a part of that. So that's the downside. And I didn't have the time to get to know new people that I probably would have liked to have. Like I see my kids now, they know the families of all of their children's friends much more than I ever did.
Along the line, you were mentioning Chowder and marching. Various people have told us that he took a lot of heat from the old bulls for stepping out of line, getting into tax policy when it wasn't his business.
I guess so.
Did he ever bring that home?
Well, I knew that. It took me a while to get to know all the inside workings, and the Ways and Means Committee would have been one that he would have liked to have been on, I guess. But I think he, knowing that he wasn't marching to anybody else's drummer, I don't think it bothered him that he was into that policy and that wasn't his field. I think he just figured, and I figured, I didn't think, oh, those guys are criticizing him because that's not his field. Nobody talked to me about that. Mm-hmm. And he didn't really, although I knew that some of the old bulls, or whatever you call them, we were friendly with the Michaels and even Bill Archer, of course, he was Ways and Means. I'm sure he and Dick Scholes, who was Ways and Means, and here was Jack out there.
Supposedly, now somebody told us that he'd taken a lot of heat from Mel Laird in particular.
He may have, but I don't even know about that. Now, Mel Laird lived over here. I knew Mel and Barbara. Now, he was mostly military, right?
Yeah, but he was, senior, and I guess...
Well, Jack was on defense appropriations.
Right.
So I don't know what positions he took there that went against Mel Laird. He never said anything about that.
So how much did Jack bring home political questions and tactics and strategies?
I would say he didn't do it all the time at all. He would come home after being there all day, and he really didn't. And we had dinner together as a family, even if it was 8:30 when we ate, because the kids, I'd just give them cereal earlier. And so we did have dinner together, but it was mostly on their terms and things that they could understand. And if I had read something and had a question, then he'd really like to talk about it. But I would say that wasn't a major thing. I didn't hear a lot of those things. I think I was aware that he was, they might have thought that he had a huge ego, because he did.
Did he?
Well, yeah. And so,
What does that mean?
Well, in their meetings and everything, I don't think he probably ever took a back seat. He was president of the freshman class, and I don't know if that was just the Republicans or the whole 92nd. I don't know what that was, but he was president of the Republicans. So I think he assumed a leadership position, and he probably always made his, and he was new into politics. I think he was insecure because he knew sports, but what did he know? He didn't have a law degree. He never had a political office, and most of the guys elected had. So he had to have a little inferiority there, but he made up for it with his assertiveness, I think. And I knew that they must have some jealousies
About
his, taking the limelight on some of these issues. But then he got elected to be conference chairman, and that, I think, was very gratifying to him and to me too.
So where does his persistence and his positive attitude toward life come from?
Well, I think it's basically the Christian Science that is, it's also not just Christian Science. It's the power of positive thinking. And
did he read that book?
Probably. Oh yeah, he did. I think we met him once. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And it fit right in with Christian Science.
How does that follow? What is there in Christian Science that's all about positive thinking?
Well, because they deny that there's anything other than good in the world, because they say a good God could not allow evil, so it's in your thinking that evil is there. They're very spiritually minded. There's no life, truth, or substance in matter. All is infinite mind and its infinite manifestation. So to overcome sickness or evil or whatever appears to be negative, think on the good things. Well, the Bible says, if you take all the things that say that in the Bible, it's true. But the Bible also says we live in a world that's not as God intended, and evil is real. So it's two ways of looking at life, and if you concentrate on the positive, it's a good thing, because just a little bit more concentration on positive than the negative allows you, if you have faith in God and that God is working it out even though it looks bad, that takes you through a lot.
So is that Christian Science, or is that...
It's a little bit of... Christianity has it too, but it's based on Jesus being God. So it's...
Well, real Christianity knows that there's evil in the world, and sin. And I take it that Christian Science doesn't.
No, and you can't make a dogmatic statement about it, and you do not get into arguments about it, because it's just different ways of seeing. They say that Jesus was the one who showed the way to right thinking, and that's where he was. They point to Jesus, but as the one who showed the way, not as being God and the one who came to give himself, because Jesus and God are one, and God could not tolerate sin, and mankind chose to go the wrong way.
Did you and Jack have theological discussions?
Did. But it ended up that you don't really argue about it. At least for me. I mean, I did for a while, but if we really got into it, he'd argue circles about me. Not anymore, because I had to think about it.
Did you two ever argue about anything?
Yeah, we did, but not, I would get upset. Well, I remember one time, because he was in tennis. We could not play mixed doubles tennis together. I could play with the other guy, but I was probably as good or better for my age group and everything than he was for his, given that he's a great athlete. But he didn't never have lessons. But if I was his partner, he would blame me for every shot. And I remember one time I thought, well, I'm just not going to enter into this. But I'm also not going to talk to him for a couple of days about anything other than just life in general. So, I can remember.
Because you got mad at him?
Yeah.
Because of the way he acted on the court?
Yeah, they're just, it's like you treat a child in a way. I wasn't going to, you don't reprimand him. He's your husband, and, he has his way.
But he reprimanded you?
Yes, in front of other people.
Did he do that often?
Well, we didn't play mixed doubles often, but yes, I can remember a couple of couples that we played with that I thought, this is not acceptable.
Supposedly, he would bark at people, and
I guess
they never seemed to take offense at it permanently, and he apparently didn't. But
he didn't either. He was less sensitive about that probably than anybody. But yeah, he barked at me. The older our children got, the more it bothered them. And it didn't. Pretty soon I just figured that was him, and he'd be over it in a minute. I could just go to the other room and not do it. But
what did he bark about?
I don't know. He liked to be waited upon, and I can't remember. Whatever he was thinking about at the time, if somebody didn't agree or wasn't on the same wavelength, he would dismiss you, unless you wanted to argue. He'd be happy if you wanted to argue, because he knew he could win.
So he has this great focus on what he wants to get done, and he's got this very positive attitude, and yet people say that there was a lot of ways in which he was not disciplined because of schedules. He was always late for things. He talked,
Overtalked.
He overtalked. So how do you mesh the intense focus with the indiscipline?
I just look at it as it was sort of the Kemp magic. He could have a sort of disorganized office and operation, but somehow things got done that were important. To me, it was amazing how many different groups of people and individuals of ideas, people who talked ideas, the philosophers, the political, the media types, that he had a rapport with that I think lots of politicians didn't, and it was just natural to him. He didn't try to do that. It was just part of who he was. And so I just looked on those things as, well, that's who he is. He has an incredibly messy office, but somehow when he wants an article, he knows where to go to get it. And he has things up here in his brain that he's handling, and he's pulling the strings of all of them, and nobody but him knows what they are.
Somebody described his operation as he was a scrambling quarterback all the time.
I think that's probably true. He knew the lay of the land. And I think he probably knew he didn't know it perfectly, and he sort of put up with whatever it was he didn't get right, and then just went on. He didn't focus on anything that was behind. He just moved ahead.
So did he keep a messy house? Or did you have to pick up after him?
Yeah, and I tried, just not doing it for a week or so, but that didn't work.
So what would he leave lying around?
Whatever it was. He just didn't straighten things up. He didn't put his things away.
So he was a legendary reader. When did he do all his reading?
He read at the same time he was watching television. He would always have several things going on. I can't do that, but he had an ability to multitask long ago, I guess. So he'd, like his plane trips, he'd constantly read, but he'd also be there to have conversations with people.
Did he ever do any recreational reading, read novels, or just history?
I'd say most of what he read that was light would be biographies of real people. No, I don't think he read many novels.
Did he have any insecurity about being a jock or not being taken seriously?
Especially after he came here. So I think that he took a back seat. I mean, although he was elected chairman of that freshman class, I think he realized, wow, here I am with lawyers and legislators and idea people, and I'm a PE major who played pro football. And so his strong point was that, yes, he had a public name already when he came here, but I think he was humble about that and recognized that this is a new world. And so he was insecure. He was insecure about that. So I think that's what made him tenacious about reading and studying and getting up to speed on. He wasn't interested in the inner workings of Congress. Remember that guy from Maryland? He was in his class, I think, who was an expert in the way the House works. That little short guy? He was a Republican. There was some little scandal in his life, and I can't remember now what it was, but you'd know who it was because he was the inner workings of Congress. And Jack didn't really think about that or the leadership things. You know, Newt was always focused on that because he'd studied political science, hadn't he? And history.
Yeah, history.
And Jack didn't. So he just learned government on the real path. He was there, but he didn't care about that.
How did he take being sort of lampooned as Bob Forehead? Do you remember that cartoon?
Yeah. Well, he was vain about his hair. I mean, when I first met him, his head was shaved because he was an athlete. And my mother thought, oh my goodness, I wonder what he looks like with hair. But it was like this long. You could see his scalp. Then he let his hair grow, and he had very thick, great hair, but it was kind of unruly. And he had to blow dry it, and those were the days that you didn't even do that. But he had to do that. He couldn't just play tennis, wash his hair, and then go out. So that was just sort of a given. I don't know that I ever thought about what men did with their hair, but my father was prematurely bald, so I hadn't, and so were my brothers. So anyway, that's just what he did, and he didn't ever say anything about those caricatures. But then he made fun of himself, like that joke that Bob Dole said about Jack's hair. Do you remember that? Somebody fell into it, and it was like it was sprayed or whatever, and it was sprayed. But he didn't act terribly sensitive about it, and I could understand that because he really did have to spend time making his hair look the way it did.
So you said he was vain. In what way was he vain?
Well, he cared what he looked like, and I think he made himself somehow look a little better than maybe he would have if he hadn't. You know, he had a rugged look about him, but
did he buy? He must have bought custom clothes, right? I mean, did he have
no,
or did he buy them off the rack?
Mostly he bought them off the rack. A couple trips that he made overseas, he had a suit or two or whatever made in Hong Kong. They didn't ever look great on him, so he ended up not wearing those. No, he bought at Joseph Bank and Brooks Brothers and whatever. Nordstrom. No, he did not have tailor-made. He had a few shirts for a while made, but they weren't any better. You know, he just had a big neck. He had an athlete's neck, and he had a long back and long arms.
Did you like tie pins?
Well, I don't know when he started wearing those, but he wore them longer than most people.
everybody, I guess, knows that Lincoln and Churchill were his heroes. Were there any other particular heroes that he had?
Well, Wilberforce. He liked that movie, Men for All Seasons. Who was that? Thomas More. He read about Napoleon and, all the big leaders of the, he read Russian history. History he really liked and had enough of a background in college that he could put all of that into that grid. His brothers liked history, mainly the two older ones. So he just had a great love for the classics. He bought our kids the Will and Ariel Durant, what's it called? History of Civilization? Something like that. And he would read those things. He would get that out. He and Charlie Flowers, during the off seasons, would talk about the history that they were reading. And so he just had a love for real things, real events.
Okay, tell me about Jude Wanniski.
I don't know when he first met Jude, but it was when he was in Congress. It was probably in the late
1976.
70s.
It was
late
1976.
70s.
Yeah, that they met. And supposedly Jude came to his office and they talked all day, and then he came here and you cooked him dinner, and then they talked
did that a
deep
lot.
into the night.
Did that a lot. And I didn't realize how complex Jude was. And probably I didn't realize how complex Jack was. They had a falling out eventually, and I don't know exactly what that was about. Jude drank a lot, and I think he sometimes would call late at night, not real late, but if Jack didn't do what he thought he should do, and a lot of what he said, the way the world works, he had some good things to say. But I'm not an economics person. About the biggest thing I said was, I think they ought to call it incentive-oriented economics and not supply side. Why is it supply? Do you know?
Well, I think, yeah, it's supply because the Keynesians are all think that there's not enough demand, and you have to pump up demand, put money in people's
Oh, and Jack said supply it first and people will want it?
Exactly, and there'll be enough, yeah.
Okay, so, I just thought that was one step beyond.
So who did you tell that it ought to be called incentive economics?
Jack.
And
well, because a lot of the things that he did, that he talked about, I said, you know what? I have to make too many mental gymnastics to think about that. Say it as simple as you can, because otherwise people are going to turn you off. So that's about the only thing I think I helped with, but I also went over some of his speeches. He liked me to do that. He said, do you have time to do this? And I would just read over it and make little marks.
And did he took your advice on speeches?
I would say yes, so that I would do it the next time, because I thought, yeah, he really does pay attention to that if I take the time to do it. But he had all these people at the office too who were good, John Mueller, and I didn't want to be usurping anything that they did, but a big picture thing like that, like incentive economics, I don't know if he ever told them, how can we figure out a way to say it easier, and I think they decided they couldn't. That was but do you think the general public ever knew what supply side economics was?
I don't, actually.
I don't either.
I still don't think.
I don't either.
I think incentive economics, it would have been a good title for it.
But
did you ever talk to Jude about that? Because Jude was the person who
coined that?
Yeah.
No, I wouldn't. I'd listen to them, and I would say something sometimes, and also with Art Laffer. But, that is out of my arena. I did a term paper on the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. And so I had thought that through a little bit, but I'm not an intellect. I just get the great big picture.
In 1980, Jude and Irving Kristol thought that Jack ought to run for president. And I guess Frank Shakespeare and a bunch of other people actually did polls and stuff like that. Did Jack ever?
And what did Frank Shakespeare come up with? That he shouldn't?
No. I think, as I understand it, they thought Jack ought to run. They actually took polls and stuff like that, and I just wonder whether Jack ever thought about running against Reagan in 1980.
No, I don't think so. And it wasn't, remember, he didn't run against Javits either for...
Yeah, why didn't he run against Javits?
I think that he respected his experience and his being senior and knowing New York, all of those things better than Jack did.
And
he felt more comfortable with the national race than he would have that, I think.
So, now, supposedly, if Javits had stepped down, Javits had Lou Gehrig's disease, and the question was Javits going to...
or D'Amato? Is that...
Yeah, that's the year that D'Amato ran against Javits.
If Javits had stepped down, even though that state of New York wasn't really Jack's, I think he saw things in a bigger picture than having to do what New Yorkers wanted. That's just my view. I just know that it wasn't top on his priority list to be senator or governor of New York. But had it dropped in his lap like Congress did, he would have said, at least I would have said, well, that is here for you. And you're not, he wasn't waiting for what he could do next to further his career, I don't think. I think that he wanted to further the ideas he believed in, and I think he knew he wasn't a perfect candidate. He was pretty realistic.
Were you there when Arthur Laffer, this was out in California, Arthur Laffer wanted Jack to go tell Reagan, look, I'm going to run against you, but I'm really, at the convention, going to throw my delegates to you. But this was all Laffer's idea to get Jack to be vice president.
Now, I don't know about that because I know that we went out there and we met with Reagan, had lunch, just Jack and Reagan and me. And it could be that that was sort of at that time, but I didn't ever think that he was running. I remember knowing that that was maybe a remote possibility. But because of his respect for Reagan and his knowing that he was young, I mean, who did he think he would be to do that? I don't think he ever considered that. But I think he realized that there were people like Laffer and Winooski and, people who push the guy that you think you've got some say with to do things. So I think he was wise enough to take his own counsel on that. But he didn't talk to me about it. But I remember that lunch, and that's the one, I think, where he talked to Reagan about tax rates needing to be lower. And Reagan understood the concept more than most politicians did.
That's what the lunch was about?
Yeah, I think that's what it was about. Mm-hmm. I remember the table where we were sitting. But I also remember that I got to events like that having lived my life, and so here I am trying to get up to speed and just listen mostly.
So what do you remember about the Detroit Convention, 1980 convention? There was...
Yeah. I remember that there was talk about his being a possible vice presidential nominee, but it was sort of on the back burner, but I knew he was a national leader by that time. And I remember Jimmy Kemp going with us to Ralph Wilson's house where they were having a Republican fundraiser or something. I can't remember what it was. And Jimmy, we were late getting there, and so Jimmy greeted all the people who were getting off the bus to go to Ralph Wilson's estate. People still remember that.
This is in Buffalo?
No, it's in Detroit. Wasn't the convention in Detroit?
It was, yeah, it was. I didn't realize that Ralph Wilson had an estate in Detroit.
Yeah, that's where he's from.
Ralph Wilson lives. Oh, wow.
He's from Detroit. That's where he made his money. I mean, he was always an absentee owner of the Bills.
I see.
And so I just remember, and we were there. He water skied there. We stayed there. We may have stayed overnight at his place there. And so I remember that, and I don't remember where the other kids were. Jeff graduated from Dartmouth in '81, so he may not have been there for that convention, but Jimmy was, because he was still at home.
And do you remember anything about Jack's speech?
I remember Frank Shakespeare helping him with it, probably Jude, but I don't know if Jude was actually there. At that point, I think I was thinking, I don't know about Jude. He's kind of a... So he wasn't front and center, but with Jack he was. I mean, Jack would talk to him a lot. And Bob Novak. And Art Laffer. And did Art Laffer and Jude get along?
They did until they didn't.
It's sort of like Jack. But Jack always got along with Art pretty well. Art was wild and crazy. I remember him sitting on the floor in our dining room talking. The kids were there. And he's just, he's loony. But I figure, a lot of economists are.
What other anecdotes do you remember about
From
either
Detroit?
or Jude or Laffer or any of those people?
Well, I just remember that Laffer we saw occasionally. We went to his house in California. He would come here periodically. He did that napkin thing. I mean, Jack had a lot of people in his life like that he saw at work, and then he carried it over. And so I heard about the Laffer Curve napkin thing, but I wasn't there for that.
Were you here when Jude Winniski talked, I guess it was Judith, into changing her major?
I think I was. Yeah, I think so. She was a French feminist for a while. I talked her out of that.
You talked her out of that?
Mm-hmm. No, I listened. Let her do her whole thing, and I just gave a few little things, and so she realized that was way out there.
Dave Smith told me a story about the Detroit convention that Jack almost didn't get to make his speech because some previous speaker went on and on and on and on, and that Mike Deaver said, cut Jack out, put Kissinger on, and there was somebody named Dan Evans, a congressman, Daniel Evans, from Maryland?
From Maryland. It's not Dan Evans. Okay, it'll come to me. But
who
what
was
about
in charge of the platform and put Jack on so Jack could make a speech. Did you know anything about that?
No, I have a slight memory of that, but hardly any. But I don't think it might be Evans.
Tom Evans. Right?
Yes, it might be Tom Evans. I remember his wife. But I didn't know that he had that much power in the party, whatever it was, the convention. That must have been what it was. He was a convention leader.
Yeah, there was a demonstration for Jack to be vice president after he made his speech.
Yes, I think I did know about that. But see, that was all very hush-hush. Dave Smith would know about that. And probably, was Dave Hoppy there then? No, I guess he didn't work for him yet. Dave Hoppy was a great AA for Jack. And Dave Smith was, too, in their own different ways. Dave Smith was more political.
And why was Dave Hoppy a great AA?
He was calm, and he wasn't having to be out there. He just did his work. He understood Jack. I think that he was good.
Okay. So why do all of your kids' first names start with J?
Well, you started with Jack and me. And Jeff, I don't know, we hardly even thought about it, but he was Jeffrey Allen, and Allen was named after one of the New York Giants, who was a really good friend of ours. Still is, Alan Berry. So we had Joanne, Jack, and Jeff. And then we thought, well, let's do a girl, J, so Jennifer. And then Judith, my sister's name is Judith, so we named her after my sister. And then Jimmy was the tail end, and we thought, well, we're not going to name him something that doesn't start with J. So Jack's joke was, well, we figured we had better name Jimmy Jesus. So it ended up with James.
Why do your girls not have middle names?
Well, I didn't have a middle name. And so I didn't think that you needed to have it. And of course, I suppose the girls told you that, especially Jennifer didn't like it that she didn't have a monogram. Did she tell you that? She made up her middle name to be Lee so she could be JLK.
I didn't know. She didn't tell me that. But she did say that the boys had
cars and middle names.
Yes. How come?
Well, the girls didn't have middle names because I didn't, and my family said, you know what? You'll have a middle name if you get married. And in those days, you assumed you would. So, and my mother did not like her own middle name, so she didn't care if I had a middle name. And some people might have thought I was Joanne Maine. They knew they wanted to have 2 syllables for my first name because my last name was Maine. And they spelled it Joan. And so on my birth certificate, it's Joan. But they pronounced it Joanne. And when they realized that nobody pronounced it that way, they changed it just in signing my name, Joanne. But Jack always joked and said, well, you know, we're not really married because your birth certificate says Joan.
So why didn't the girls get cars?
Well, in high school, the boys probably needed it more because they had football practice, and it saved me. And Jack's family had given cars to their kids, even though his father could hardly afford it. But, I mean, they did. They all had cars. In L.A., they probably needed it more than... I didn't ever have a car that was mine. The first car I ever had was when I was married to Jack. But, I don't know. I didn't think about them needing a car, and I guess Jack didn't either until they were, I guess, in college. I think that... No, not in college. It was out of college. As soon as they got out of college, they needed to have a car for whatever. So he did buy them a car then.
So were there different rules for girls and boys? I mean, were boys preferred in this?
Well, they think so, but I think it's mostly a joke. I think that but Jack didn't go to, you know, Jennifer's tennis matches were at like 3:30 in the afternoon. He wasn't going to come from Capitol Hill out here. He couldn't because Congress is in session. So, and the games for the boys were on weekends, and he did, you know,
was that Friday?
make sacrifices.
That's Friday nights?
Well, mostly Friday nights for the boys now, and they still are now in high school. Boys are, and Judith didn't really. She had ballet recitals, and he went to a few of her ballet recitals and piano recitals, but they were not always convenient for him, so he didn't. But basically, I never wanted them to think that he didn't pay attention to them because he did all that he could. So, you know, I saw other wives always being critical. And the kids get that. And I didn't want them, I instinctively knew that they needed to see all the good things about what he brought. And they did. Because I really didn't resent the
So
times.
did you make up for it? You went to all the recitals and
Yeah.
And you went to the football games too?
Oh yeah, and baseball games and basketball games.
And you still do
Soccer
it for grandchildren?
games. Oh yeah.
So what was your division of labor as parents?
He gave me the authority to take care of the home and whatever needed to be done here, and I'd put schedule. You know, I'd give his office the schedule of games, and he really made a point. Well, Jerry Ford told him early when he came here. He said, "Jack, I regret that I didn't go to all of my son's games," and he said hardly any of them really, because by that time Jerry was a national figure and was going all over, but so was Jack, and so he just made that clear. And then Bob Wilson and Pete McCloskey told Jack and me both when he first came here, make sure that you pay attention to your family and your home and your marriage. And Bob Wilson said he and his wife did get a divorce, but later, after he'd been here a long time, because he said she never came to my committee meetings, and he wished that she'd known what was going on the Hill. And Pete McCloskey just said, I think maybe he got a divorce too. I can't remember. Did you know him?
Vaguely.
They both made an impression on both Jack and me. Pay attention to the home base.
So did you go to committee meetings?
No. Or a big, if they would address a major something.
If he
just go
was,
once in a while.
If he was making a floor speech, would you go?
No, not when it was just normal session. But I at least knew what committees he was on and the issues that he was up against. So that's about all I could. I mean, I went down a lot for wives events, both the Federal Forum and the Republican Congressional Wives, and then the Congressional Club, and I did my internet. I did a lot of things that were just activities, but they were all things I liked.
Were your boys as sports crazy as Jack was when he was a kid?
Jack was maniacal, first about baseball when he was little. I mean, he knew every statistic and all that. He lived in his own world, according to some of his family. He had his charts and all this stuff. So he loved baseball, and he went to a lot of the games because his uncle-in-law was a part owner of the Los Angeles Stars or Hollywood Stars baseball team. So he went to baseball games and did pro baseball and pro football. Bob Waterfield was his big hero. The college football people were his heroes. So he was maniacal about that. And our kids really weren't, although reading the sports pages was what the boys did do, sort of regularly. They weren't as maniacal about it as Jack was, but Jeff wanted to play pro more than we knew. But I think it's, having played, I think he felt pressure too. But he didn't feel so much pressure that he didn't want to go into it himself.
Did Jack put any pressure on him?
No, he was very, very good. He was not, his family didn't put any pressure on him. In fact, they probably wished he wouldn't be as maniacal about sports. So he really was good with the boys. I don't think he put pressure on them. I don't know what they say, if they felt it. Once they got into it, he got more involved. Once he realized that Jeff really did want to play pro, he wanted to encourage it, and he would talk to him sometimes about how he handled the loss and that kind of thing.
Do you remember what he said about how to handle a loss?
Oh, I know he and Jeff had letters back and forth that only recently did Jeff tell me about. I think he probably wrote about that in some of those letters.
So Jack is very competitive. He loves to win and all that. Did he create any sense of competitiveness among the kids or anything like that, or were they?
They were very competitive. I mean, Jeff, I remember playing tennis with Jeff when he was in junior high, and he just got furious if I would beat him. And I remember a time saying, Jeff, I can't play with you anymore because that's just not acceptable to act that way. So we didn't, and I just remember that very clearly. And I also remember with Jimmy, when he had to decide whether to go back for a 5th year of football because he had his tuition, he was a red shirt, so his class would have graduated. He had to decide if he wanted to do another year of football in order to go on and have the possibility of playing pro. And so he didn't know what to do, and Jack didn't want to overpressure him. And so Jack said, I think he said, well, do whatever you feel is right for you to do. So Jimmy and I went to lunch, which didn't happen always. I'd say, let's go out to lunch. And I had written down the pros and plus and the minuses, pros and cons. And I asked him to do that too, and then we'd talk about it. And so I remember doing that. And I did it as a Christian who believed there was a plan for his life and that he had to look at the whole picture. And I thought he probably should go back and play another year because he always wondered if he could have. So he did do that. And he did go on and play pro for 7 years.
Right. So Jack used to say, be a leader to the kids. What did that mean?
I think it was just general. He wanted them to know that they had to decide, what was right and what was being assertive on your own behalf and do what's right. So he had these little cards, his business cards that were big. He would write little notes on that.
Did he ever talk about what leadership meant or how to be a leader?
Well, he would talk about it in spiritual terms. He would say you are in your right place. Wherever you are is where God intends you to be. He would spiritualize the same things that agreed with what we heard when we went to church. He would always lift out the positives. And if it was emphasis on sin or that, he just kind of dismissed that.
If the sermon was about sin, he wouldn't take that in. Or
well, it was at the church that we go to. It was never just about that. It was always about sin plus
redemption.
Yes. So there was enough that was wonderful that he would focus on that.
So whatever happened if the kids did something wrong? I mean, how did that?
Well, one time Jennifer really was defying us and lied to us about staying at the beach at somebody's house. You know how the kids go to Rehoboth. And we found out that she told us a lie, that she was staying with somebody's house. And actually they stayed on the beach that night. And so we both said, that's not acceptable. So we talked to her, and there was a thing that we had gone to called the Institute in Basic Youth Conflicts. I don't know why we had gone, but we knew we had teenagers, and the culture then was a little different than it had been when we grew up. Today, I suppose parents are doing the same thing, only in a different arena. But Jack and I had gone to that. I don't know why we had, but it was down at, I think it was at Constitution Hall, and knew that that was a good thing, but you couldn't make your children do that. But we had seen what it was like, and so we made Jennifer go to Institute in Basic Youth Conflicts, which is a whole weekend seminar. And we didn't go with her. She just had to go. That was her consequence for lying to us. And then she did another thing that was a broken car window. I can't remember what that was. And so we just said, truth is, you need to tell the truth. You need to honor your parents and our rules. And so she did that. And we agreed. Jack and I were very much in agreement on whatever we came up with. And they went to the youth group at our church, and that was a good thing for them. And Jimmy had mentors, as did Jeff, of men, youth leaders. It was very good, and Jack liked that. So I think that he agreed with me, and they had pretty good guidance. Then when they went off to college, they did their own thing, almost all of them, except for Jimmy.
What do you mean they did their own thing?
Well, they didn't go to church or Christian groups or anything. They just did fraternity, sorority. Once in a while they'd go to a church service, but they didn't really have a faith element to their lives.
So how did Jeff become as...
Yeah, after Dartmouth, where he was in the Animal House fraternity. Were you in that one?
No.
The Betas?
He was, that wasn't the Animal House fraternity. That was AD. But Beta was a jock fraternity.
Yes, it definitely was. Well, I called it the Animal. I mean, whenever we went there, it was... So anyway, after Dartmouth, which the only Christian group he went to very often was the Catholic one, and his friend Mike Lempres, he was at the dinner the other night. Did you meet him? Great guy. And he was in that Catholic group, and I didn't know about it until I talked to him the other night at the dinner. I said, Jeff always said that the Catholic group at Dartmouth was the one that he sort of went to the most, and it was just that they had, then he told me about it, they had...
Newman.
Yes.
Right.
And they went there to study, and it was a place where you didn't have to have the drinking because you got that in your fraternity. So anyway, Mike explained to me, and that Joe Nolan had applied to Dartmouth. Did you know that? Judith and Chris's only son, and he got turned down. But he didn't get any recommendations. He didn't ask for Jeff, Mike Lempres, Scott Andrews, who went there. Did you know that? Yeah, Scott went there for his first 2 years, Jennifer's husband. He didn't get any recommendations because his father, Chris Nolan, wants the kids to do it on their own. But anyway, he didn't get in. He just found out the day after the dinner that he did not. He was there at the dinner. Anyway, I told Mike that, and then Jeff, you said, how did Jeff? So then when he went to play for the Rams, he had to make his choice of which group of players he wanted to spend time with, because there was the party guys and then there was the Christian athlete group. And he went there and he met Stacy through one of their outreach socials. And so then he decided he needed to return. He hadn't really totally left it, but he just hadn't been practicing it. And so then he went, and you've seen what he is now.
Right. So dinners. Tell me what your favorite memories are of dinners in the Kemp household.
Well, we would have dinner in the breakfast room on a nightly basis, like I told you. We probably had dinners together 4 or 5 nights a week. And he was sometimes home on the weekends, usually for Sunday night he'd be home to watch games and just collapse and be a normal guy. So we had company for dinner whenever he would want to be going to a reception or a dinner, if it was somebody that he could say, come home with me. So we do that. So we had really interesting people. Johnny Cochran was here for dinner, Gene Kirkpatrick, Bibi Netanyahu, all sorts of people over the years that the kids just got to know. And it was really, it's a huge plus. They didn't realize it at the time, but they were polite, and then the girls helped with the dishes, and the boys always shook hands and said their names and listened to the conversations as long as they could, and then they'd go do their homework.
So were there any sort of special guests whose conversation you remember?
Well, Jean Kirkpatrick was great because she really related with the kids. They liked that.
How so?
She was obviously intellectual, but her husband cared a lot about football, so they'd talk about real things, and then they'd talk about the Middle East, and then they'd talk about Russia, and so they just heard conversations that had depth, but at the same time were normal.
So how often was Jean here? I mean, were Jack and Jean good friends? Yes, we'd
go over to their house over here. They've had 2 houses out in this area, but not that often. I mean, maybe once every 3 months or less. You know how it is. You just don't have time to see people on a regular basis because his weekends weren't normal. But Kirk liked to watch football, so sometimes we'd do that. I can remember doing it at their house, and then they had boys. We got to know some of their boys. Let's see, I suppose I put down names. What number is that?
25.
Art Laffer, Irving and B. Crystal, Cookie Gilchrist, Gary Demarest, who was our pastor in New York, Chuck Colson. They remember great dinners with Chuck Colson.
What was it like having dinner with Chuck Colson?
Well, he and Jack started out arguing some because Chuck was an old-line conservative, the Nixon guy, and then he became a Christian, and then he became sort of more of a pessimist, and Jack was always an optimist. And so they talked about politics and economics and philosophy and history because Chuck was somebody who was on the wavelength that Jack respected, because at least Chuck had thought everything through. And I think when I first went on the board of Prison Fellowship, it was after Chuck had become a Christian and started this ministry, but Jack is the one who had known him. I didn't even know him. I'd maybe said hello during his White House years, but Jack knew him. So it was interesting. We had that. He knew him, and then Chuck got to know me as a Christian, and he asked me to be on the board, and I know it was only because of Jack and my relationship and who we knew, and, I know how those things work. But then Chuck and I had a good rapport because I had studied worldview issues, and so had he, and Prison Fellowship was doing the real work in the world with prisoners, which is what he started. But at the same time, Chuck knew that we needed to think through justice and all these things from a Christian viewpoint, and not the way he had before he was a Christian. So we then did things with Prison Fellowship. We went on a cruise where they had wonderful speakers every night. You had dinner table conversations. So we got to know.
Did Jack come along on those?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He did all of that. And he loved those people. Those were the people that he respected because they had careers. You know, the other board members were mostly businessmen. Some were black. And I got to know a lot of them, and he did too. And so that was just, so then when Chuck and his wife would come here for dinner, it was never, you know, we didn't have parties per se, other than if it was chowder marching or a political event where a lot of people, but mostly it was just small little groups. And so conversations with Chuck and people like that, well, like Crystals, those are in-depth, good, substantive. You know, you've been around that. And so I just love the fact that that's what Jack brought into my life that I don't think I would have had without him. I know I wouldn't.
I mean, a lot of Washington political dinner parties or dinners consist of who's going to run for what, and who are you for president, and who's going to get the nomination, and stuff like that. I think that yours were more about ideas.
Yeah, and Jack didn't ever talk about that. Like, we would go to the Al and Judy's for events. We probably saw you there, and Chris and Kathleen Matthews, and had really good conversations before Chris Matthews got, I don't know where he is now, but I still like him a lot. But those are the kinds of relationships that I feel that were really wonderful, because these are people who thought about the same things we were all the time. And you.
Even though they disagreed.
Yeah. Jack liked to have that.
What did he get out of having spirited discussions with people he disagreed with?
In the earlier stages of his life, he was competitive and he liked to win arguments. I'd say the older he got, the more he just appreciated having a dialogue about ideas, and he didn't have to win, because he realized that everybody comes from where their starting point is.
So were you there when Bill Brock and Jack had a fight about AIDS on an airplane going to the Super Bowl?
AIDS,
AIDS, yeah.
No, but I remember Bill Brock and Jack and maybe Jesse Jackson. It had something to do, Bill Brock was chairman of the RNC at one point, wasn't he? Mm-hmm. And Bill Brock is a forward-looking conservative, I think, and I think Jack thought so too. I think it was Bill Brock and Jack that were more open to civil rights things. Is that right?
Yes. But Bill...
No, I don't remember that. I was not there.
That they almost came to blows and that you broke it up.
Well, I don't remember that. Okay. It was an airplane trip?
Yeah. And as long as we're...
Oh, I think that might have been in a private plane.
It was on the way to the Super Bowl, or on the way back.
It probably was. And I think it was a private plane. And I may not have been right there in the middle of it. I may have come and said, you know, you're not going to get anywhere on this. No, I don't remember that at all.
What was it that Jack said to Connie Mack's wife, Priscilla, that Dan Coates wanted me to ask you about? Some sort of disagreement or argument or something like that.
I can't remember, but Priscilla is very opinionated. And is she a recovering alcoholic? I think she might be. It might have had something to do with something like that. Because those were couple friends, the Macks and the Coates and us and Armstrongs, but we didn't all get together. That was probably a time when the Macks and the Coates and us were there. I can't remember.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't remember if it was political or psychological or addiction or whatever. I don't remember.
Coates would not tell me, and he just said he asked you or ask Connie Mack. So
I don't remember, but I think it might have been at dinner at Normandy Farm out here, but I can't, or maybe it was at Congressional. and I can't remember. But it would have been in the latter years. It would have been in the 2000s, I think. I don't think it would have been when they were in Congress.
So what was Jack's relationship with Newt Gingrich like?
It was professional because, Newt was Jack was a leader of the Young Turks when Newt came, and then Newt was one of them because he's obviously educated in history and all of things, so he was an idea guy. But he was also a practical politics guy, which Jack was not. But he appreciated what Newt knew about that. I don't know. I think that there was probably some... Newt, I don't know if he was jealous of Jack. I just think they were two strong ideological guys who were on the same side of the party. I mean, they were both conservative. Personally, we didn't, his first wife, Jack didn't know, and I did a little bit. And then his second wife, Marianne, we were with a couple of occasions. And Callista, I did not know before he married her. So as couples, we really didn't ever, we weren't close. So socially, no. But then when I told you he'd come here for dinner occasionally, and that was just Newt. It wasn't as a couple. So you said, what's their relationship?
Yeah.
I think it was pretty friendly, but they weren't. I think that Jack got upset with Newt, but almost all of the Republicans did at times.
Because he was too aggressive? Or?
Well, he'd go here and then here and then here, and he didn't stay. But I think it's because he had opinions on all these ideas. I don't know. Okay. I can't analyze that.
So tell me what all of your activities were. You did Bible study. When did that begin?
Soon after I came here, I was in the Congressional Wives Prayer Group, and they had sort of a leader that led that, and that was both parties who were Christians. It was a prayer group. And then I also started Community Bible Study, which is the one that Millie eventually came to, but it started back in the 70s, like 73 or 74 maybe. And I also at the same time started a class that met at my house every week, studying worldview. And it's still meeting. It's a biblical worldview, but it includes the secular worldview too: philosophy, history, looking at the arts. Looking at how faith affects the way you live, and your views about politics and everything. So, and it was Dr. Francis Schaeffer's books that we started out reading, because we started meeting because Congressional Wives Prayer Group was having Dr. Schaeffer's wife come and talk, and they couldn't meet at Fellowship House that day. That's the one that used to be down there. I can't remember, but the car dealership guy whose wife became an ambassador, they bought that house. You'll remember, she became an ambassador. Anyway, they had to meet at my house because they couldn't meet at the other house. So Dr. Schaeffer's wife spoke to us about the feminist view of women as opposed to the biblical view of women. Some of it was the same. And the congressional wives that were there, most of it was my friends. And not all were Republicans, like Carolyn Bonker was in it. Remember Don Bonker from the state of Washington? Oh yeah, they live now where you do, on Bainbridge Island. Is that where your place is? They're on Bainbridge now. Anyway, it was a group of women who were interested in what the Bible has to say about everything: politics, marriage, feminism, same-sex marriage, anything that's an issue. Back then, same-sex marriage wasn't even talked about. But we started meeting in the 70s, and we studied all of her books and his books and C.S. Lewis. And we didn't do Bible study per se, but eventually we occasionally would do a Bible study. And that group is still meeting at my house every Friday. But it's changed, my daughters come now. And, it's still some congressional wives, but it was media wives too. Verma Boyd, whose husband Forrest was the White House correspondent for UP, what is it called?
UPI?
UPI? I think it was UPI. So she was in it, and John Hart's wife, remember John Hart?
Mm-hmm.
So it was a conglomeration of people. Anyway, I did that, and that happened every week that we were in town. And it's continued. So that was, and we had homework. But then so did community Bible study. So basically, I'm a study junkie, I guess you say. And there are too many groups now that I could be in. And then that prayer group started by Susan Baker and Holly Leachman for the president's wife, whoever it happened to be. That started in 92. Is that when?
With Hillary Clinton.
Hillary,
right?
yeah. And that's still going. We meet every month. So all of those things, that's what I did. And I also was in International Club, and so I was president of that. And that's ambassadors' wives and congressional and media wives. And that's been going for a long time. It was started by Marian Adair, a congressional wife from Indiana, to get diplomats to know real Americans outside of this glitzy embassy type thing. So we meet at people's homes. So I had them here for lunch when it was my turn, that type of thing. So the International Club. And now that Jack's no longer in office, I was in it for 22 years because he was HUD secretary and in Congress. And then once your husband's no longer in office, you're not in it, and you just go once a year, which is okay with me. But I liked that group because it got me outside my world. So that, and then I was also in Republican Congressional Wives, and I was president of that when Reagan was elected. I was president of that. And then I'm in the Republican Women's Federal Forum. I don't know if you've ever spoken for that group, but that's sort of a...
How did you get involved in the issue of Soviet Jewry?
That was because of Jack, and it's Sharansky. It was Sharansky's wife who came and spoke here, and Helen Jackson, Scoop's wife, and I, and Teresa Heinz and Metzenbaum's wife were the sort of co-founders.
So Avital Sharansky comes
here. She came and talked about him, who was in prison.
Right.
And so that brought a lot of people, both parties, who were interested in this. And not everybody was, but Jack was, he was a logical one because he'd gone to a 98% Jewish high school. And so Brownie Reed invited him to, he went, you've probably heard this story, he went on one of his first congressional trips, and he was on the Education and Labor Committee. Did you know that?
Yes, I knew that, but I don't know about the trip.
That was his first trip that I remember that he did. And we didn't do congressional junkets. That's one reason I didn't get to know. I liked these other groups where I got to know congressional wives, because as couples, we didn't go on any of those trips. Once we were scheduled to go, and Jennifer got mono, so I canceled and he went. But that's how you get to know these congressional couples. But anyway, he went to Poland. I don't know why they went to Poland to study education. But when they were there, Brownie Reed, do you remember him? He was a Democrat from New England somewhere.
I think New York.
Maybe New York. And he asked Jack if he'd ever been to Israel, and Jack said no, but he knew the history and everything, and he liked Israel, he thought. And Brownie Reed said, well, while you're here, I'll get you to a trip. And so Ezer Weitzman gave Jack his tour. You know who that is?
Mm-hmm.
So he went down to Israel, and he got the whole thing. And you know how it's wonderful because you get a lifetime of education in a short period of time, and he just lapped it up. And then he met somebody whose husband was in the Soviet Union, and he got them out when he came back, and the Soviet ambassador's wife was in International Club, and Jack had a meeting after that with just the ambassador. I happened to know her socially, and he didn't know him, but he then talked about this prisoner that was in Russia and said, what about this? How can you do this? And this was the Jackson Vanik all this time when they were...
Do you remember who the prisoner's name was?
It'll come to me. I think that's the one whose wife killed him later, after they came over here. It'll come to me. It's a story in itself. It will come to me because it stayed there. So he mentioned that to the Soviet ambassador about this over breakfast, and Jack's the one that told me the story. And he said, now so-and-so is in prison. His wife is in Israel, and this is how you're treating them. And he spit his soup out over lunch. The ambassador did, in answer to Jack. That's Jack's story. He's probably embellishing it, but it wasn't long after that he was released. And then they came over here to settle in New York. Now, it's written somewhere because the National Conference for Soviet Jewry, remember that group? Mm-hmm. They're the ones that sort of got our congressional, they organized us. So if we'd planned, they would help us. We didn't have a treasurer, we didn't have a group, we were just...
So what did you do?
I was the co-founder, and we had trips. We went to Israel, we went to Russia, we met with the foreign minister of Russia during a time that it was really kind of scary. And
when did it start? 70s?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, but I had teenagers, and Jimmy was little, and so all of this, I didn't make diaries on this, but it was very powerful. And I went to Israel by myself. I also went to Spain for an international conference of the people involved in Soviet Jewry. Way, way over my head. Carol Bellamy, was she a New York legislator? She and I happened to fly over to Spain together, I think. And, I mean, I think of those things, I hardly ever, I just did it, and then I went on with my life. But it was very meaningful because we then, Helen Jackson and Dolores Bielenson, her husband was a congressman from California. Helen and I aren't Jewish. Dolores Bielenson and Metzenbaum were. But it was just good to have Jews and Gentiles and Democrats and Republicans all caring about the issue of how the Soviets were treating their Jews. And they did the same to Christians. So the Armstrongs, Bill and his wife, Senator Bill Armstrong, and Jack and I made a trip to Russia where we visited Christians who were imprisoned. And we met their wives who were out. And we also, on one of those trips, met Vladimir Feltzman. Remember the pianist? He was a famous pianist, and he could only play in Siberia and places because he had requested to go to Israel, and they didn't let him go. And he was a dissident. And he eventually came here, and Jack sponsored him, and we met him and kept up with him and his wife. And he's still...
How many trips would you say you and Jack took overseas together?
I've been to Israel about 14 times, and all but maybe 2 or 3 of those were with him. And, we went to Europe several times, and National Conference for Soviet Jews, I went to England with them. And I don't know how many together. We went to...
Were there any other issues in which your passions meshed?
Well, being aware of communism and the economics of the world, I would say. I was on the same page with him, but I was just along for the ride.
Okay, tell me about Sundays. So you go to church.
And then he would prefer to come home and have lunch at home. I would have loved to have gone out to brunch, but that wasn't part of his day off. He wanted to come home and have lunch and watch games so that he could watch whichever one he wanted, and he got hooked up to as many stations as you could get.
So what'd you have for lunch?
Barbecued kielbasa or tacos or hot dogs. He loved hot dogs. Hamburgers.
Diet Coke?
Yeah. No, he didn't drink Diet Coke. He drank...
Regular?
Well, he drank regular Coke most of the time. Maybe he started drinking Diet Coke. I never did have Cokes too much myself, but maybe he did. Did they say he drank Diet Coke?
People said that he drank gallons of Diet Coke. No?
Maybe he did. I thought it was just Coke. His brother was president of Coca-Cola of Los Angeles, and so that was... He didn't drink Pepsi, he drank Coke.
So he'd watch football and read the papers simultaneously?
And watch the History Channel, or, he'd flick around.
Did he used to critique the plays that he saw?
Yes, but he often would read the reviews before he saw a play or a movie.
Oh, I was talking about the plays on TV. The
Oh, the
plays.
football plays.
Yeah.
Oh. No, not overly so. I think he just knew it in his head, and he knew if one of the boys were here, he'd talk about it to them. He certainly didn't to me.
So what did you do while he was?
Well, I was in the kitchen usually, or I would save up my mail to do. So I would do, open the mail and do it while I was sitting in my chair and he was in his. But I was always getting up to get something for him or for me,
Triscuits.
or yeah.
So give us the recipe for Triscuits. This is your famous.
It's chopped up green onions and Parmesan cheese and mayonnaise and Worcestershire sauce, and just put on Triscuits and grilled, so they're just lightly browned.
And he liked them.
Yeah, I mean, I could always that was always a go-to appetizer, and then hot fudge sundaes for dessert.
Okay, you had this place in Vail, or have this place in Vail. How often did you go there, and what great memories do you have?
Well, we
of that
started
place?
out going to Aspen. We from when we lived in Buffalo, we went to Aspen with the ski club, a group of people we knew in Buffalo. So we were introduced to Aspen at that point. So we bought a place there, and we had that for maybe 4 or 5 years. And Ford was minority leader then. And one year we went over to Vail because they were there and said, come over and ski for a day here. So we did. And it was hard to make the payment. We rented the place out when we weren't there, but there got to be bad rental years. So we thought, let's sell this. So we did sell it. So then we didn't have a place anywhere. But the Fords had invited us to stay there once with them overnight. And then we met some people. Then we stayed at some friends of theirs and ours house there in Vail. And then Jimmy got hurt. Jimmy got hurt in Aspen. We had gone over to go skiing there with him, who was staying in Vail at a friend's house, but going over to Aspen. He hit a tree and really got bad knee. You would have thought he'd never play again, and he was in college at the time. So, that might not be... I can't remember the progression, but we realized that we wanted to go to Dr. Steadman to get Warren Miller, the ski movie guy, told us to go to Steadman. If you're going to have his knee looked at, be sure that Steadman at Vail does it. Don't let him do it in Aspen. So we went back to Vail to have him look at it, and he operated. And so then we had to go for rehab in the summer to Vail, and we'd never been to Vail in the summer before. And so we said, oh my goodness, this is a great place, and rather than going to California and staying... We didn't have a house there. We had relatives, but we thought maybe we should buy a Vail. So that's when we first went half and half with Mike Shannon, because, long story anyway, we got a townhouse in Vail. After a few years, we outgrew it because we had grandchildren by then, and so we bought what we now have, which is a duplex, and we have both sides 7 bedrooms and room for our family.
By this time,
then
Jack was out of Congress and...
he was still in Congress.
Oh, really?
No, yeah. By that time, he was...
Oracle board.
He might have even been out of HUD. Yeah, he might have started making money. Yeah, because we couldn't have... We might have bought it with Mike Shannon, because he bought half and we bought half, and it was rented out sometimes, but Mike Shannon wanted it for the pool. He lived there. He was the president of Vail, a young whiz kid from Wisconsin. So that helped us buy that house. Then when we did sell that, we made some money and stepped up and were able to buy what we now bought. And he was making money by then, so we had this house. It looked like a house. So Vail became a place that we really liked in the summer because we got out there because of Jimmy's injury and saw the concerts and the summers, and the Fords were there, so we would see them when we were out there, just not all the time, but once in a while. And we just made a lot of friends who were locals, and also some people who came once in a while like we did, but mostly they were locals.
And you used to have a lot of guests out there, right? I mean, people from Washington would come
Yeah,
out.
well, not a lot, but some did, yeah.
Who?
Well, we had congressional people like Jerry and Holly used it one time for somebody who was dying of cancer. They used our rental unit. I remember Bo Derek came once, and that's her husband had died then. And we'd met her on was it Reagan? It might have been the Reagan campaign, but maybe it was the '88 campaign. She was a famous Republican person, so she came and stayed with us once. And Chris and Kathleen Matthews came once and stayed in the side next to us. Britt and Kim came because they're friends of Jennifer and Scott's, so they came. Alistair Begg came, and with his wife. He's the pastor in Cleveland. It's so great. I don't know, what number are we now? Veil guests.
29.
Okay, Sonny,
So
Bono and Mary, Tommy Franks and his wife, all my prayer groups, that one that I told you, Praise for the First Ladies, they all came there, just the girls, not their husbands. And another prayer group that I'm in, that Marcia Coates is in, came there. And we loved the concerts, and we had still have a number of couple friends. So when I go out there, it's still couples, and that's nice. And we biked and went snowmobiling and things like that. Jack and I did. And by this time, we're empty nesters completely. Everybody's married.
So Jack was a notoriously competitive skier?
Well, yes, he was, but it was just like tennis. I mean, because he's a good athlete, he went fast, and he's big, and he didn't have ski lessons, just like tennis. So you'd go whatever the popular thing for the time was. We learned the old-fashioned way. I can't even tell you what it is, Arlberg or something like that. And we both did races in our age groups sometimes, just because that's what charities do. So we would do that. I won for my age group one year.
Did you take lessons?
I took a few lessons back when we lived in Buffalo. I mean, that was in the 70s, because you could do it. We were 20 minutes from a ski slope in Buffalo. That's where Jeff got to be such a great skier, because he was skiing on ice, basically.
Okay. What do you remember about Super Bowl trips?
Well, the first one was in Los Angeles, and we could have gone to the Super Bowl if we had not lost to the Green Bay Packers or the Kansas City Chiefs.
Yeah.
We lost
Green Bay Packers are NFL.
No, but by this time it was.
The first.
Yeah. We could have gone
Super Bowl. Yeah, if you hadn't.
Because
But you didn't win the AFL championship.
No, we lost to the Kansas City Chiefs, who then played the Green Bay Packers in the Super Bowl. Is that right?
I think so.
I think that's what it was. And so we went to that, and Charlie Flowers, our buddy, went, and Herb Klein and Leon Parma, who was Jerry Ford's friend. He was Bob Wilson's AA here first. But anyway, those are San Diego friends. So we had San Diego people go with us for the first few years, like Pete Wilson and Bob Wilson, the congressman, and Herb Klein, Tom Pownell, who was president of Martin Marietta, who was always here. There were a whole group of people like that, and my really good friends, the Marks, he was Dow Chemical's Washington representative, so they went, and often they'd pay for the party, because that was a good deal for them, because they got to meet all these. But it just kind of fell into place, and it got bigger and bigger, and then when Jack was running for whatever, it was a good place to have people come, and it wasn't really a fundraiser. I don't think we ever used it for fundraising, but it was a good PR place. Because, we knew mostly all the football owners through Pete Rozelle, because Pete was really, really a good friend of Jack's. And
what was their friendship based on?
Well, Pete was an old Los Angeles guy, and he was with the old Los Angeles Rams as a PR guy, I think, at first. And so he was a little bit older than we, but not all that much. And Carrie, his second wife, was younger than me by a little bit, but not a whole lot. And his daughter from his first marriage interned with Jack. They just got to know each other well. And Pete was a Republican. He was a business guy, but he was PR. And he was just a good, solid guy. We liked him a lot, and we got to know, I didn't know his first wife, but I knew Carrie really well. She'd give me her hand-me-down clothes when she'd get she was gaining weight, so she'd give me all these designer clothes because she said, you need clothes for Washington. So she'd send me a whole box of clothes. I still have some of them that are designer things that I never bought. And so we were just good friends, and we would see them every year at Super Bowl, so we had access to tickets to buy. We didn't ever get free things, but all of our friends were delighted to get tickets, and they could buy them. And then Sharon's Alaska put together our parties, and it just fell into place. They weren't elaborate. I mean, we just barely had a room to have the party in, but then all of our friends could, both the celebrities and the non-celebrities, could mix.
And then you started having speakers, right?
Yeah, there would be, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Michael Novak. And, did Jack ever seriously consider trying to be NFL commissioner?
Well, I remember, was that right after HUD? I think it was. It was when he was no longer going to be at HUD, and he had decided not to run for Congress.
Or president.
Well, what would have
Pete Rozelle died, right? And
well, Pete Rozelle was having difficulties, and they had sort of retired out to California most of the time, I think. I don't think anybody had Paul Tagliabue. He'd been on the scene, so Paul probably was ready to. I can't remember if Jack. There was a possibility of that, and I remember thinking about
Ed Rutkowski said that he was sort of depending on Jack to be NFL commissioner. Ed was, and that he was going to join him and do, sort of be his chief of staff or something like that. So
well, I never got that far. I knew that was a possibility, but that's when Bush had just
maybe he became HUD secretary instead.
He did.
Yeah.
It was about that time, and so the options were maybe NFL. Who knows what else he could maybe do, because he didn't have any money saved up. We'd spent all of his congressional retirement chunk sum on our two daughters' weddings that happened in 89. Or we were about to spend, let's see. So that's when this would have happened, and we thought about that, but I didn't I liked the NFL because we knew most of the owners and we knew the Players Association people, and John Mackey and Jack were very good friends, so we got to know Sylvia and John. They went to all these Super Bowls with us after for the last few years.
Okay, let me just walk you through a little more politics. So in 1981, Reagan's elected. He gets to be the number 3 leader of the House, and then David Stockman sort of turns against Kemp Roth. Do you remember how Jack responded to that?
I just remember Stockman coming over here for dinner fairly regularly. One time I remember he brought Judith Miller. Did you know that he dated her?
I think Judith, never mind.
Did you interview Judith?
No.
Oh. That's the same Judith Miller.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
I like her better now than I did then. I don't know why, because I didn't know that much about her. And then he was dating Jennifer, so they both were here for dinner. And I just looked at Dave as the Dave Stockman that I knew, and I liked him. He was gentle, and I just liked him. And I knew that he was really smart on economics and things, and I think he also had a theology degree.
Yeah, he went to Harvard Divinity School.
So I just liked being around him. I didn't know all the stuff that he was doing. Was he OMB then?
Yeah.
I didn't know all the stuff that was going on. I just knew that he changed from what he had been before.
How did Jack respond to that?
He didn't get angry. He really didn't. He just didn't. I guess he just wrote people off as, okay, well, that's where he is. As far as I know, he didn't waste any
Jack never got mad at anybody?
emotional energy. He may have inside, and I know that he didn't respect him. I remember that I didn't go to Dave's wedding, but I think that was before this happened. I'm not sure. I had one of the few fevers that I'd had, and it was a terribly snowy night, and I didn't go to the wedding, and Jack did. But after that, we didn't see them. Well, no, I think that happened before Dave went. I think by the time that he was at OMB, he was probably married to Jennifer. Anyway, we have seen them since. I remember being with them at Aspen once, socially. And we've always been friendly with Jennifer and Dave. But then once that happened and he left Washington and went into business, and I know that while that was happening, lose any sleep over it, and I don't think he did either. I think he was sad, but I don't think he was terribly surprised, maybe.
Okay.
Who else? Darman. Was Darman
yes,
around?
Darman is later. Darman really was trouble for Jack during the HUD days.
But didn't he come around a little bit later? I don't know what he did then. Jack personally befriended him because he had a son who was ill. And so personally, I think Jack just looked at him as a person. I don't know. I mean, those are the things I'm sorry you couldn't interview Jack about, because it'd be interesting to see what he would say about all this.
Yeah, Darman was pretty nasty to Jack during, and especially to what he was trying to do at HUD because he was OMB director and didn't want to spend any money, and Jack wanted money for HUD. And
yeah. Okay. See, those things I would just hear a little bit about, and I knew that Darman and he had some differences. But I also knew that he had this personal connection with him. And Darman was close to Jim Baker, I assume.
Very.
And, I mean, I just know all that, but only up here. It wasn't any big deal.
So you're friends with Susan Baker, and Jack had some run-ins with Jim Baker.
And some of it was over Israel, and some of it was Jimmy Baker saying Jews don't vote for us anyway, and all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
And I knew that was happening, but also there was always the divide, the Bush people versus the Reagan people, and Jack was a Reagan person, and they were the Bush people, and you just knew that. And then Jennifer, our daughter, got to be very friendly with Doro Bush during the '88 campaign. So the person, and Scott Andrews was Marvin Bush's best friend, and when Marvin has had all of his disease. Anyway, Scott Andrews went to the hospital with him. They've always been good friends and business partners. So the personal connections, in my view, were just as strong as the other. But I also knew the political, that there was that divide, and I understand it because I'm more on the Reagan side, just emotionally. But practically and personally, closer to the Bush people.
So if the Bush people or Baker leaked some story in the papers that was nasty to Jack, and they did when for example when he would oppose Reagan's tax increases, how did he take it?
He didn't get angry. He didn't like it.
Did he bring you the paper and say, look at this?
No. I would say he would tell me about it. I did know about it. Or I would ask him a question. I just heard such and such on TV, or I just read this newspaper article. I read editorials. I may not have read all the news, but I always read as many editorials that I liked. I wanted to know more about what the headline said. So I knew those things. Sometimes I knew things like that ahead of him, but mostly not. Mostly he knew it first. But I just ask him, and then we talk about it.
Novak would have it all.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I would read that. And I thought he was too biased, really, for a newsman. Well, he wasn't a newsman. I guess he's a columnist.
Yeah. So the 1988 presidential campaign, why did Jack run for president?
I think it was his supporters pushing him, and it didn't take much to push him. He must have thought about it, absent talking about it for a while, because by the time they started, I think I didn't hear about all of these things. I mean, you know, you consider a staff. Staffs want to know that the guy you work for is going to keep going. So I think that's probably what it was.
But he must have consulted you about it.
Yes. I mean, I would hear and read anything that was... So, yeah, I was not in the dark. But I don't think I really thought... He was pretty young, wasn't he? 40...
1988. He was born in, what, 1935?
35.
So you do the math.
He was a newcomer. He was not the establishment. I knew enough to know that.
George Bush was vice president.
I knew totally. After he was not named as vice president in 80. To me, that said, you know, he's going to continue to be a leader in the House, maybe run for Senate. But I didn't think about president.
But he obviously did.
He obviously did. And his people obviously did, and that's not surprising.
So, but did he, insofar as a presidential run involves a lot of family work and exposure, did he ask you what your opinion of it was?
Not really. I think he got pretty far down the road before he actually started talking to us about it. And Jeff, at that point, was playing pro football. What year was that?
88.
Oh, yeah. He was in the middle of he was still with the Rams, I think.
So you were out campaigning a lot, right? In 88? I mean, he's running for president, primaries in Michigan.
Oh,
and
by
Iowa.
then, yes. Yeah, by the time he had decided. He must have decided in 86 that this was something he would sort of work quietly with. I think that I didn't really get it, that he was actually going to run and say, yeah, I'm going to run the primaries against Dole and Bush and who else was running? DuPont, Pat Robertson, whatever.
So did he and you think it was a long shot against Bush? I mean, Reagan was sort of for Bush.
Yes, but once you started thinking about it, you saw that the Reagan Democrats, the emotional intensity of the conservative movement was a real thing, as was the establishment. So they'd had 8 years, right?
Right.
Or almost 8 years by the time we got
it. Did the Pat Robertson candidacy take you by surprise? In other words, all of a sudden,
I think it really
evangelicals
did.
come roaring in and they're against Jack.
Yeah, because I am an evangelical. Did you know that Pat Robertson's daughter-in-law was at the dinner the other night?
No.
She has met my daughter Jennifer. And they were at the dinner the other night, she and her husband. I'd never met her.
So how did Jack take losing?
There were so many things going on. You know, you have a campaign, you have a lot of money you've had to raise, and you had to decide whether to keep going after, losing in Iowa and then New Hampshire, and then they decided to go on to South Carolina. Was that the next one?
Last one.
And I wasn't in on any of those. I mean, I was still raising a family, and I wasn't an inner circle. I didn't sit on campaign meetings. Now, his brother Tom was. It's too bad you couldn't have interviewed Tom, because Tom, really great guy. And he was very aware of just a lot of things. And he was a businessman, and he was just a wonderful guy.
So, but did Jack, Jack the great optimist, positive guy, all this kind of stuff, he puts it out there to run for president and he gets shellacked. I mean,
He didn't get depressed. He went on to doing whatever he could do. You know, he was playing tennis. He would play more tennis then. He had that big fall where he messed up his ankle and his back and everything.
What happened
over
then?
here? Well, do you remember the president of the Chamber of Commerce, Agnes and Dick Lesher? They live right around the corner, and he played tennis with Dick Lesher. He had a court at his house. And so after I think it was after Now, what year are we talking about?
88 is when he ran for president.
Yes. And that's when Bush Quayle came in, right?
Yes, right.
So after that convention, I remember we came back here, and here it is summer, and he wasn't going to be in the Congress, and he wasn't going to be in the cabinet. That's what we're talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, he didn't know if it. And he was playing tennis with Dick, and he didn't get his car in park right, and so he had one leg in and one leg out of his car, and the driveway was on a hill, and the car started rolling and dragged him down. And so his ankle was all back to the bone, and his back was, and he was bleeding and everything. And he had to go to the emergency room, and it took a while. So that ended his tennis for a little while. And
break bones? Did he break bones?
No. No, he was very fortunate. It could have been a horrible thing. The driveway turned, and so the car stopped because it didn't go around this. But then that fall is when Bush asked him to be in the cabinet, right?
Right. Yeah.
So that changed.
After the election. The election's obviously in November, and he...
Yes. No, but that other that I was talking to you about was the period where he didn't really know what he was going to do, but he was still in Congress. And he still probably had his staff saying, oh, what are you going to do next? Or maybe you'll be in the... I don't know what they said. But when Bush asked him to be in the cabinet, he thought about it and talked about it, and it was fine with me. And
now, somebody told me that you are the one who convinced him to do it.
Well, I thought that made sense. I mean, it wasn't a field that he knew a lot about, but he knew about everything. And I didn't know what else he would do that would be challenging to him, and he needs a challenge. So that made sense to me. So I probably did.
He identified himself as a bleeding heart conservative. And what does that mean to you?
I think he just called it that because he cared and he wasn't a liberal. Didn't they say bleeding heart liberals? Well, he called himself a bleeding heart conservative. I don't know. That's all I could think of. What do you think?
Something like that, yeah. I just thought maybe he...
No, those are the kinds of things that he said that I just thought it's second nature. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. We didn't talk about it.
No. Okay, the 1996 campaign. Were you surprised that Dole asked him?
Yes, I really was, because I don't think in terms of what they must have been knowing about Dole's race, because we weren't on the inside, because obviously he and Dole weren't on the same page. Dole was not a supply-sider. I thought of him just as a conservative, but I never thought that deeply about how their differences were.
Did he ever talk about Dole and what he thought about Dole?
He didn't say bad things. He thought he was a patriot and just conventional old-line conservative who didn't see the Opportunity Society, the Conservative Opportunity Society, or whatever the other side was. Dole wasn't there.
Incentive-based economics.
Yes, yeah.
So how did you find out about the offer?
Well, I don't know if he'd been having any talks. Maybe he'd had talks with Scott Reed, because Scott Reed had worked for Jack at HUD, I think.
Yes.
And so Scott was he campaign manager or something. He was a consultant, at least, for Dole.
No, he was his campaign manager.
Okay. But I had not been thinking about that campaign. We were not even going to go to the convention for sure. We thought we'd go. He had not been asked to speak at the convention, which seemed kind of strange in a way, because he was sort of a popular speaker. And so he had a speaking tour, and he was making money with the Washington Speakers Bureau. So that was sort of what he was doing. He was into making money. There was just a short little window there, but he was. And so he had a speaking schedule, and we thought we would go to California and stay at his brother Tom's house at Laguna, and if we wanted to go down to the convention, we could. It was in San Diego, right? Yeah.
Yes.
So I had not been thinking past whatever, and so it was, whose birthday was it? It might have been his birthday, or maybe it was Scott Andrews' birthday. We were going out to Orange, Virginia, to Coleman Andrews' farm, where we were going to be celebrating. It might have been Jack's birthday, which is the middle of July, but it might have been Scott's. I don't know when the convention was, but Scott's birthday is August 6th. That's Jennifer's husband. So we were driving out there, and he got a call from Scott Reed, I guess, saying, Dole would like to talk to you, and he'd really like to talk to you today. And Jack said, well, I'm just on my way out to Orange. And so we got out there and we had dinner, but Jack had said, well, I'll come back. So Jack came back. Now that's a long drive. Do you know where that is? Orange, Virginia? It's not a long drive, but it took us a couple hours to get out there. So he came back and met at the Watergate, I think, with Dole. And I came home with one of the other family members. So when I got home, he said, well, they want me to think about accepting for vice president. And so that's a whole new switch. But because it was coming up really soon, the convention was only, I don't know, a week away? I don't know how long it was, but it wasn't very long. So it's kind of vague in my mind what went on back and forth after that. I think he sort of turned it down.
He did?
I think he did. Or he didn't accept it. And so Scott Reed called, and I think he thought it was me that was saying, I'm not sure about this. And I don't know how he said it. It was overwhelming, really, to me. But as you can see...
Scott Reed called you? Mm-hmm. To say what? To
just say, are you aware that Jack is really not wanting to go any further with this? And I said, well, no, not really. He said, are you opposed to it? And I said, no, I'm not locked in stone anywhere. But unless he really wants to do it, and I don't know, there's a lot to think about. So I can't remember what happened there, but I think I said, Jack, it could be that this is where you're to be. It might be that this is God's plan for our life. So I wouldn't say no, absolutely. Just think about it some more. So however it happened, we both became more comfortable with it. I mean, how often...
Why would he not want to do it?
I don't know, because in his own mind, he either has... he probably had some demons in his life that he hadn't come to grips with. So I don't know what it was. He did not specifically... He knew that, he was not the establishment. Dole was. That his ideas wouldn't necessarily go whatever. And I don't know what he thought about. But for whatever reason, there was a point where he said, well, who else is going to be Dole's vice president? I think Connie Mack was one of the possibilities, and that would have been good. But I think Jack was a better choice for Dole. I mean, Jack was he had a engaging persona, and he had ideas, and he was able to communicate to normal people if he'd cut down his dialogue, if he'd just make it shorter. So I don't know. I mean, I just figured, well, we've been amazingly taken care of down through these years of his career. So it was a no-brainer then to both of us, and we said, okay, go for it.
So did you have, after Scott Reed called you, you must have talked to Jack.
Mm-hmm.
And
just said, are you prepared to do this? And we both said yes.
And so did Jack then get back that night or some?
I don't know, but it was it wasn't, I mean, I remember I was probably in the porch talking on the phone. I just remember being around here. And then pretty soon there was media outside watching everywhere we went. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting.
This is before you got snuck into Russell, Kansas.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
So,
this is before. We were getting ready to go to Florida and Texas where he had speeches. And so we were saying, okay, we're going to spend a couple weeks in California. We'll stay at Tom Kemp's house. And this will be our vacation. And we may go down and go to the convention for a day or so if we want to. But he had no invitation. So we were sort of at a different spot, just like, you'd been involved in every election for years and gone to conventions every year every 4 years for years. So it was a different place, but it wasn't surprising. He was making money, and we were, we'd already bought our house at Vail, I think.
So you, how was the, tell me about the unveiling. The Russell, Kansas trip.
Well, then that was interesting because we were going to Florida, so I had to pack for, women think about how are you going to go to events and have the right clothes to wear to the things that you now are going to have to go to. So I had all I could do to think about that, and the kids, okay, they had to know about this. They had to get themselves ready. I mean, I remember going to the convention in New Orleans when we didn't know.
You might have been vice president then.
Yeah, it was the same way. And I remember Marilyn Quayle talking about getting their kids' clothes ready, going to because she and I were in this same little Friday group. So, I mean,
Marilyn, just to go back to that, did you and Marilyn Quayle talk about the vice presidency? You were
not specifically, but I remember playing tennis out at Pat Birch's house, I guess it was, and we were just talking about going to the convention. And I can't remember why it was, but I think she was thinking about it more than I was. Because Jack was definitely not one of Bush's favorites. So I didn't even think about it, really. I knew that was a vague possibility. And by this time, Jennifer was dating Scott, whose previous girlfriend had been Barbara Bush's social secretary. I mean, we had all these little things going, and so...
Well, just to go back to the '88 convention and this vice presidential talk, you had all these lines into the Bush campaign and family.
Yeah, we did, with the
so
Bakers.
What messages were you getting out about the possibility of Jack's being vice president?
Not any for sure. I knew that it was a vague possibility. And Pat Birch and I were best of friends. That was Dean Birch's wife. And Susan Baker. So Susan, Pat Birch, and Sally Chapleton and I went to play tennis every year out in Arizona. So we were close. And Marilyn Quayle once in a long while would play tennis with us, but she was of a younger generation and more of a loner. She didn't have the close little relationships that I did with Susan Baker and Pat Birch and Sally Chapleton, whose husband was at Treasury at that point.
Okay, so you get to the convention, and they're supposedly...
And Jack was speaking, doing that major speech that you said almost didn't go?
No, that was a different one. That was 1980.
Oh, that was
88.
88.
Oh, he 88,
okay,
he makes
all
another
right.
speech.
You're right, okay.
Yep.
This is 8 years later. Yeah, so
By
this time, Reagan Bush had been in, yeah.
Yeah, so Bush is being nominated. Bush is...
And we were basically on the outside because we were the Reagan people.
Okay.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of talk about...
Well, Quayle was a Reagan person too. So Quayle was one of these young Turks, so to speak, with Jack, sort of.
So do you remember Jack getting the call from Bush that he wasn't going to be the nominee? No. It was in your suite, I think.
In New Orleans?
In New Orleans.
Well, I remember knowing that it was going to be Dan before it really was known by other people. I don't know. Maybe that's right. Did they say he got a call in our suite in New Orleans?
Yeah.
Probably that makes sense.
Okay, let's jump back to '96 now. So, how did you get secreted out to Russell, Kansas?
Okay, we were packed for 2 weeks out west, but knowing now that we were going to go to Kansas, but we didn't know how. So we went to Florida where he gave his speech, and the media was all around. And during that time, we were also talking to our kids on the phone because Jimmy was playing pro football, and I don't know, Jeff was playing football, I guess. I can't remember now. But at any rate, no, maybe he was retired. Anyway, we were talking to our kids and then going to Texas where he was supposed to have a speech, but I think he canceled that one. And so they took us, Sheila Burke, who was Dole's top gal, and Wayne something, not Wayne Berman, another guy, met us at at the small airport in Dallas. Not the big one, but more in the city. And so we met them there, and we were going to fly from there to Kansas, which is what we did. So I just remember, this was, okay, now we're in a whole new mold. We're going to be plugged into this campaign, and I'd never even thought what that was like. So we did go at night and got there pretty late at night and stayed in a little motel, and I washed my hair every day then, and I didn't have a hair dryer with me because most hotels had hair dryers. This one didn't. So in the middle of the night, I didn't have shampoo, and I had to do my hair for the next day. So I remember that, and I remember thinking, wow, what did we get into? And I don't think I slept a whole lot that night, but Jack was fine, he did. But I had to wash my hair and get myself ready to go the next morning to the Dole's home, where we were going to meet with them first, just privately. And then at the end of that time, they were going to announce that he was the pick. So, I just remember doing a lot of praying. I knew that I had, my prayer group at home. I think they probably, no, they didn't know. I didn't have time to talk to anybody. We didn't do emails then. At least I didn't.
I don't think anybody did. Anyway,
no.
Let me just jump to the debate. What happened at the Gore debate?
Well, I do know that they wanted him to take on Clinton.
Gore. Yeah.
And, Jack just was not mean-spirited, and I don't know what all they wanted him to say. And I think it was the senator from New Hampshire that...
Judd Gregg.
Yeah, Judd Gregg, who did the... And I went to a couple of those things. I just remember being sort of overwhelmed because I thought, these guys are lawyers. Jack is not a lawyer. He has not done those kinds of debates. He really, he sort of wrote his own script. Anything he did it the way he wanted to do, and he didn't do what they told him. And so he didn't follow people's, like in his own campaign, he didn't really do all the things that the professionals wanted him to do. He rarely had a script that he spoke from. They got him a little bit more disciplined, but then here he was plugged into the Dole campaign, and he had to do it. I think he was pretty good. I think he did mostly what they told him to do, but this was bigger probably than I thought it was. Maybe he knew. And I don't know what he did. He didn't make any big mistakes, but he did not take on Clinton.
Right.
I think he just wanted to get across growth ideas and opportunities for all Americans and reaching out and being inclusive and whatever. I don't know. So I'm not a good one. I think all the...
So was he just incapable of attacking anybody except their ideas? He just couldn't be negative? Is that...
I think so. I think that was just against his DNA. I don't think... So when whatever it was they told him, and I don't know what they told him. I don't know if they gave him talking points on you've got to attack him on this, this, and this. I don't know. But I'll bet some people know that. Who were his advisors then?
Well,
Dave Smick wasn't still around.
No, but we've got people who have talked about that. I just wonder whether
No, they
from
would
your
know more than I.
perspective-
I
okay,
really
okay.
didn't.
Did he, after the debate was over, how did he think he'd done?
He didn't think he'd done well, but then there were other times that he'd done, major speeches that he probably didn't think went real well, either because he didn't get a chance to say everything he wanted to, or didn't, or he didn't discipline himself and didn't. So he didn't think he'd done real well, but I don't think he. I mean, I didn't think he lost. I thought that he did okay, but I wasn't as on the scene as all of his staff were. I'm sure that they were really disappointed.
Okay. During this period when he was making money and on boards and stuff like that, did he just jump to this new role in life? Being on Oracle board and
I don't think it challenged him because it wasn't ideological on the type of things he wanted to think about. He didn't have a platform. He didn't have a base. His base was him, and he was scattered. And he had some business.
Was he the kind of guy who needed an audience? A crowd?
It might be that because he'd always had one. I mean, from the time he started playing football, through Congress, through HUD, and he then was a national figure, although it wasn't a huge national figure, but, he certainly was recognized and listened to whenever he said things. So, yes, I think it must have been. But he poured himself into, like he had this Venezuelan business thing that sort of was going, and there was somebody in London connected to it, and it wasn't really great people, and, all those kinds of things that he kept himself busied with that I didn't even have to pay attention to. Jimmy did, because by that time Jimmy was working with him.
Right. Okay. I don't know how deep into this you want to get, but on his when he got sick, we're down to the end here. How did he take the prospect of dying? He knew he had a terminal illness, right? Or did he fight it like a?
No, he didn't fight it like a lot of people do. Let's see, what did I'm glad you gave me this. Let's see.
43.
I said that he wasn't self-analytical, so he did not reflect or talk about death. Christian Scientists don't have funerals. He had always said he didn't want a funeral. And I said, well, memorial service is something. And so before he got sick, I remember having a discussion with him, and he was adamant, I don't want to have a funeral service. And I said, well, memorial service? And we were talking about making wills and things, and he didn't like to talk about that. At least in speaking or writing, he didn't want to get that down. He just didn't want to think about it. So he was not, I don't know if he was discouraged. I don't think he was. I think he just took it, and whatever went through his mind. Jeff would come and visit, and we'd pray and read the Bible and say whatever Jeff wanted to say. Sometimes he was by himself with Jack, and Jack had other people. Colson came and talked to him. JB, you know who JB is? James Brown.
Oh, really? James Brown, the football player.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
People that really wanted to talk to him personally about life did come and visit with him, and he liked that. Colson was one of them, and JB, and Jeff, our pastor, Alistair Begg, who gave the prayer at Jack's memorial service. So there were a few people that he talked to personally about that, and me. We would read. He really liked Psalm 16, and he liked the book of Colossians, and he would have me. I'd say, "You want me to read you anything?" And he'd say, "Yes, that." But his brain was affected a little bit at the end, so he wasn't his total self because the cancer had gone to his brain, and he had had some radiation on that, so it maybe arrested that. I don't know. But then he quit having treatments. It was harder on him to have the treatment than not to have the treatment. Mm-hmm. And I just think that the doctors don't tell you you're going to have a certain amount of time. The doctors did tell us that they didn't think he'd last more than 4 months. Even having chemo, I don't think. So,
because it was pretty riddled, mm-hmm, right, with mm-hmm. cancer at the time. Okay.
He could have fought it. I mean, there are things that you can do. We went to New York. He did the things that were not going to Texas. He didn't want to go to Texas and live at the hospital.
Right.
MD Anderson.
So what do you think were your greatest contributions to his career and his life?
I think just knowing that we were raising a family, we're married and committed to our family and being together, and our ideas were the same, and I didn't make big issues out of things that were not huge life-changing issues. And he appreciated that, and appreciated that I was just sort of there to listen. But I had my own life, I had my own friends. He appreciated my being different than him. I had better friends, close friends, but I think women do more so than men anyway, especially men like him.
Because?
Well, because he was sort of a loner in a way, in that he was, he had to measure up to his brothers and make his own way and be tenacious about whatever it was. I don't know what went to make him up. I couldn't be self-analytical. I read a book early on in our marriage that was called The Art of Understanding Your Mate. And basically, it was a Christian book, but it was a psychologist. If a change is needed, all I can change is me. I cannot change somebody else. So I just figured, okay, he needed encouragement and to be listened to by me.
Everybody says that you were his ground, that you grounded him. What does that mean?
Well, he did appreciate me. I know he did. I think that he appreciated me more than even he realized it. And I kind of felt that. So I was not anything other than wanting to understand him, but I didn't. There's just lots of things about him that I didn't understand. But then I realized that's the way we all are. Nobody understands another person perfectly. We all come from different backgrounds. So I think he appreciated that I didn't have to be in his face about things.
Okay, what haven't I asked you about that you think I should have?
I think it's pretty complete.
So how do you?
I really feel that I'm glad that I had him in my life, because I think that he made me think things through more than I probably would have before. I'm pretty simple, from a small town, and I just think that the life that he exposed me to, and himself too, I think that having me there made him better than not having me there.
So how do you think history should remember him?
He'll probably be remembered in political history as somebody who was a conservative Republican, but who was inclusive and not divisive and not mean-spirited, and got along with both parties. And nope, you didn't have to be a political party. He was not a party person. He was an ideological, practical, competitive. The battleground is either on the sports field or in the business community or labor capital or what you believe, ideology. And so that was his lodestar. And he enjoyed that, and I think he was good at it. He was smarter than I think people realized he was.
Thank you.
Thank you.